The candles burn low, their glow flickering through cut crystal and gold. The air hums with laughter, perfume, and something sharper an edge beneath the sweetness. Servants pour from bottles wrapped in velvet, a dark red wine that gleams like blood beneath the flame. Each sip brings warmth, delight, and a quickening behind the eyes. No one notices the tremor in their hands, nor the bright flush that lingers too long. Outside, the city dozes beneath its gaslights, unaware that decadence itself has found a new religion bottled and blessed by royalty. It is the height of the Victorian Empire, an age of marble palaces and fevered progress. Trains roar, factories breathe, and the nobility chase vigor in glass and powder. Vin Mariani, they call it coca wine, the tonic of emperors and saints. From drawing rooms in Paris to the chambers of Windsor, its praise is whispered like prayer. It promises life without fatigue, dreams without consequence. The Queen drinks it, the Pope blesses it. The world toasts to its own awakening. But beneath the chandeliers and music, something begins to stir. Faces flush, pupils bloom, and the pulse of empire beats too fast. What began as medicine becomes ritual. What glittered as genius reveals itself as hunger. So today, pour carefully. The glass in your hand holds more than wine, it holds the ghost of an age that drank its own delirium. This is how it began when royalty tasted cocaine, and the world mistook addiction for elegance. The candles burn low, their trembling flames mirrored in the blood-colored glass. The hour is late in London, that hush between supper and sleep when the world seems wrapped in velvet. In a drawing room off Pall Mall, a group of gentlemen gather around a small table where a decanter glows with the deep hue of garnets. It is not port, nor sherry, nor any known vintage from France. The liquid inside gleams thicker, darker, with a faint scent that stirs the air. Part wine, part earth, part something no one can quite name. A servant pours carefully, and the sound is slow and silken, like a secret being told. The first sip feels like warmth blooming behind the eyes. It spreads to the fingertips, down the spine, into the heart, an invisible light unfurling inside the body. One man laughs, another declares he feels years younger already. They speak of clarity, of vigor, of the strange sensation of being wide awake within their own bones. The wine is called Vin Mariani, a new French tonic said to restore what modern life takes away: energy, courage, appetite for beauty. And for men grown weary of factories, parliaments, and empire, it feels like grace itself. Outside, the fog presses against the windows like a living thing. Carriages roll by with muffled wheels, and the lamplighter's flame moves down the street in slow procession. The city hums on invention and exhaustion. Telegraph wires buzz above the rooftops. The air smells faintly of coal and rain. Inside, laughter grows louder. The men toast the future, a century of machines, of electricity, of boundless human will. They believe they are drinking progress itself. Across the channel, in Paris, the inventor of this crimson potion works by lamplight in a small laboratory lined with glass bottles and Peruvian leaves. His name is Angelo Mariani, and his hands are stained with the dust of coca, the sacred plant of South America, now powdered, pressed, and blended with fine Bordeaux. He has spent years perfecting this elixir, balancing science and seduction in equal measure. When he first tasted it, he felt the same rush, the heart quickening, the mind sharpening to a fine edge. He thought, this is the cure for the fatigue of the modern age. He could not have known that he had also opened a door that would never close again. As word spreads, the tonic crosses borders and oceans. Doctors prescribe it, singers praise it, priests bless it. In quiet corners of Europe, tired eyes brighten and hearts race faster than ever before. And somewhere in Windsor Palace, a weary queen will soon lift a similar glass to her lips, trusting in the promise of this gentle stimulant that so many now worship like salvation. For tonight, though, in that London parlour, The wine glows in its bottle like captured sunlight. The men feel alive, almost holy, their veins humming with invention. None notice the faint tremor in their fingers, nor the restless gleam in their eyes. They simply drink again. The candlelight flickers over crystal and crimson, and for a brief, shining moment, it feels as though the empire itself is immortal. But the warmth will not fade as easily as it came. In that reflection, red, rich and trembling, the Victorian world has just glimpsed the beginning of its most elegant addiction. The Rue de Clichy was still wet with morning rain when Angelo Mariani unlocked his door. The city beyond the shutters was waking, iron wheels grinding against cobblestone, the sigh of horses, the echo of bells drifting from Montmartre. Inside his narrow laboratory, the air shimmered with the scent of alcohol, oak, and crushed leaves. Rows of brown glass bottles caught the light from the window like organs inside a body. Each was labeled in Mariani's small, careful hand: erythroxylon, coca, Bordeaux supérieur, quinquina, elixir de santé. He had spent years chasing this mixture, the perfect balance between stimulation and calm, between the sacred and the scientific. The coca leaves had arrived from Peru in heavy linen sacks, their green scent still clinging to the mountain air. To the Quechua people who cultivated them, coca was divine, the breath of the Andes itself, chewed to still hunger and lift the spirit. But to Mariani, it was a puzzle. How could one capture vitality itself in a bottle? How could the energy of sunlight and soil be distilled into something civilized, elegant, fit for the salons of Europe? He moved slowly among his tables, glassware gleaming under lamplight. A copper pot bubbled on the burner, its fumes mingling with the tang of wine. Drops of extract fell like dark jewels into the Bordeaux, one, then two, then three, and the color deepened to a shade that seemed almost alive. Mariani leaned close, watching the way the light refracted through the liquid, how it clung to the sides of the glass like blood. He thought of the word vitality, of how the 19th century worshipped it. Everyone wanted to feel eternal. Explorers, doctors, artists, kings. He had read the journals, the reports of scientists studying coca's effects. They spoke of heightened alertness, banished fatigue, sharpened senses. The age of invention was also the age of exhaustion, and here, perhaps, was its cure. When Mariani finally took a sip, his eyes widened, a pulse of warmth spreading across his chest, a clarity rising like dawn behind his forehead. The fatigue that had dogged him for months vanished. The city's noise, the dull ache in his bones, even the steady drizzle outside, all dissolved into quiet exhilaration. He set the glass down and smiled. It would not be called medicine, he decided. It would be Vin Mariani, a name with the ring of both science and luxury. Something that would sound at home in the boudoir as easily as in the hospital. In his mind, he could already see the advertisements, golden lettering, laurels, portraits of the world's elite, raising their glasses in gratitude. Outside, Paris was a fever of invention. Trains roared beneath glass roofs, telegrams crossed continents, and the Eiffel Tower was rising like a needle toward heaven. Every man and woman wanted to move faster, live brighter, think more. Mariani's wine would feed that hunger. By evening, he bottled the first batch himself. Each cork was sealed in wax the color of dried roses. He lifted one to the light, watching the deep red swirl through the glass. To him, it looked like a heart beating, restless, alive. He whispered, almost reverently, "Voilà la vie en bouteille," the life in a bottle. And though the rain still fell beyond the window, inside the little laboratory on Rue de Clichy, something far stronger than rain was beginning to pour the first crimson drop of the world's most elegant addiction. Far from Paris, beyond the reach of its carriages and chiming clocks, the coca fields of South America shimmered beneath a white, merciless sun. High in the Andes, the air was thin enough to make each breath feel borrowed. The mountains stood like ancient gods, their peaks veiled in cloud, their slopes carved by hands that had worked the same soil for centuries. Women with shawls wrapped tight against the wind moved slowly through rows of emerald leaves, their fingers deft, their motions reverent. They plucked each coca leaf as though plucking prayer from a living altar. The plants whispered softly in the breeze, that dry, whispering sound of parchment against parchment, as baskets filled with the raw green breath of the earth. To the Quechua, coca was never a vice. It was survival. A handful of leaves pressed between the gums gave strength for the climb, eased the ache of hunger, and opened the lungs to the thin, bright air. It was the leaf of life. The cuca, blessed by the cuca, mountains, and the spirits who dwelled within them. At midday, the workers gathered in the shade of a stone wall, chewing slowly, letting the bitter taste fade into a sweet numbness that calmed the heart. Their laughter mingled with the wind, soft and patient. They spoke of harvests, of births, of rain. None could imagine the leaf's future, that one day it would be crushed, distilled, and poured into crystal goblets in the drawing rooms of Europe, served to queens and cardinals as a cure for fatigue. Down in the valleys, mule trains wound along the mountain paths toward the coast, each animal carrying sacks of dried leaves marked for export. The traders who met them at the ports did not speak of spirits or blessings, they spoke of commerce. The coca leaf was no longer just a sacred plant, it was cargo, and with each shipment that crossed the Atlantic, its spirit changed from ritual to commodity, from prayer to profit. When the crates arrived in Marseille, they carried the scent of another world, dust, resin, salt, and sunlight baked into every fiber. The leaves had traveled farther than any Quechua could dream, their green turned pale from the sea air. Somewhere, a clerk stamped a document, a customs officer waved the shipment through, and the magic of the Andes passed into the hands of European chemists. Among those chemists was Angelo Mariani. When he first opened a crate of coca, he was struck not by its appearance, but by its aroma, faintly sweet, alive, like cut grass after a storm. He crushed a handful in his palm and watched the dust cling to his skin, golden in the lamplight. That night, he wrote in his notes, "The leaf carries the energy of sunlight. Perhaps this is why the workers never tire." He did not know that in distilling that sunlight, he would also distill something more dangerous, the very essence of human desire. In the mountains, the wind continued to move through the fields. The women still plucked the leaves and whispered blessings into the air. But the sacred harvest no longer belonged to them. Somewhere far away, in a Parisian cellar lined with wine barrels, their ancient plant was being reborn, not as medicine, but as temptation, waiting in a bottle gilded with gold. The night had turned cold in Paris, but Angelo Mariani's laboratory pulsed with warmth and purpose. The lamps burned low, their brass shades haloed in smoke, and the faint hiss of the burner filled the silence. A thin line of steam rose from a beaker on his table, twisting in the air like incense. Mariani worked in his shirt sleeves, cuffs rolled high, eyes fixed on the slow swirl of liquid within the glass. His journal lay open beside him, its margins filled with tidy notes and the occasional exclamation mark the language of obsession. He had been chasing balance for months. Too much coca, and the bitterness was unbearable. Too little, and the tonic lost its voice. He had tried vermouth, Madeira, even port. None could carry the coca's spirit the way Bordeaux did. That rich, deep wine seemed to cradle the leaf, soften its sting, and turn its strength into song. Tonight, as he stirred the mixture, the scent rose earthy, sweet, alive, and he felt something shift inside him. He poured a small measure into a crystal glass and held it to the light. The color was perfect, a shade of red that caught the lamplight like flame trapped in liquid. He raised it to his lips. The first taste was sharp, metallic, then soft warmth spreading down his throat, into his chest, radiating outward until his fingertips tingled. The fatigue that had settled in his bones after weeks of work seemed to dissolve. He felt alert, weightless, almost young again. He laughed under his breath, a quiet, startled laugh, and set the glass down. The effect was immediate, but not harsh. It did not dull him like alcohol, nor unmoor him like laudanum. It sharpened him. Every sound in the room, the ticking clock, the crackle of the lamp flame, the faint hum of the city through the walls seemed newly precise, crystalline. His pen felt lighter in his hand. The world itself seemed to move closer, clearer. He wrote the name on the corner of the page. Vin Mariani. Not elixir, not medicine, not extract. Wine. Familiar, civilized, elegant. It would not frighten the public with talk of chemistry or the exotic. It would seduce them. Mariani leaned back, the taste still on his tongue, his thoughts moving fast. He imagined doctors prescribing it, actors praising it, travelers carrying it across deserts and seas. He imagined the Queen herself raising a glass, the Pope blessing it, the world believing that modern life with all its fatigue and noise could be conquered by a sip. Outside, a carriage rattled over the cobblestones, the sound fading into the hum of Paris at night. Mariani walked to the window and looked down at the street. The lamps glowed in a long golden line, and he thought of blood moving through veins, the lifeblood of the city, of invention, of progress. He turned back to his workbench. The wine gleamed in its flask, alive and trembling, as if aware of what it would become. He reached for a clean bottle, uncorked it, and began to pour. The sound was low and steady, the sound of history beginning. In the quiet that followed, the chemist lifted the filled bottle and held it to the lamplight. Inside, the crimson swirl caught the glow and seemed to breathe. Mariani smiled, tired, exultant, reverent, and whispered the words he had written hours before. La vie en bouteille, the life in a bottle. He could not yet see the faces that would drink it, queens, cardinals, writers, dreamers, nor the tremors it would awaken in their hands. For now, there was only the spark, the brief, blinding moment when creation and corruption share the same light. By the winter of 1863, word of the strange new tonic had begun to drift beyond Parisian apothecaries. Doctors whispered of it over brandy. Artists passed it hand to hand in smoke-filled salons. Vin Mariani, a name that rolled off the tongue like silk, promised something that no medicine or spirit had ever truly delivered. Vigor without vice, clarity without collapse. It was the age's perfect contradiction, a stimulant wrapped in the elegance of restraint. In Mariani's modest workshop on Rue de Clichy, wooden crates lined the walls. The air was rich with the scent of cork, oak, and sweetened wine. Each bottle bore the same embossed label, Vin tonic Mariani au coca du Peru. Beneath it, a promise restores health, vitality, and cheer. The chemist worked quietly among the clutter, his movements measured, almost reverent. Outside, the world was racing forward. Telegraph wires thrummed, locomotives shrieked across new rails, and men in stovepipe hats spoke of conquering time itself. To them, fatigue was the final frontier, the one enemy progress could not outpace. When Mariani's tonic arrived, it felt like deliverance. In the cafes of Montmartre, poets lifted their glasses and called it the wine that dreams. Journalists wrote glowing reviews, describing it as the elixir of modern civilization. Physicians prescribed it to weary mothers, overworked clerks, and soldiers recovering from fever. The line between remedy and ritual blurred until no one cared to tell them apart. One evening, in the flickering warmth of the Café de la Paix, a group of intellectuals gathered around a single bottle. The cork was pulled, and the aroma filled the air, floral, earthy, strangely alive. They poured it in small crystal tumblers, holding them up to the gaslight as though they were toasting the century itself. "To progress," said a young playwright, his voice trembling with irony and hope. They drank, and the room brightened as though someone had turned up the flame of every lamp. Words came faster, ideas tangled and caught fire. A painter scribbled sketches on napkins. A composer hummed fragments of melody. No one noticed how their laughter grew louder, how their hands shook when they reached for another glass. The wine tasted of promise of travel, of discovery, of a body that could never tire. Within hours, letters were written, orders sent, crates shipped to Vienna, London, Rome. The modern world had found its communion, And Mariani, its priest, from his desk, the chemist read the testimonials that arrived daily. A singer who no longer fainted on stage, a physician who could work through the night without sleep, a priest who called it divine assistance in liquid form. Each word confirmed what he already believed, that he had given humanity a gift, not a poison. He clipped the letters neatly and filed them beside his formulas, unaware that one day they would read like confessions. Outside, Paris gleamed beneath its canopy of gaslight, the glow reflected in every polished window. Horse-drawn carriages rattled past posters advertising new marvels, telephones, typewriters, cameras, and among them, Mariani's bottle, shining red against the paper, crowned with laurel and praise. Inside parlors and palaces, the toast was the same. Glasses clinked, eyes brightened. The future tasted sweet, sharp, and just slightly dangerous. Few realized that in chasing strength, they had already begun to borrow it one sip at a time from tomorrow. Morning light crept across the Rue de Clichy, thin and grey, catching on the edges of glass. Inside Angelo Mariani's workshop, hundreds of bottles stood in rows like soldiers, waiting for inspection, their necks wrapped in gold foil, their bellies filled with the crimson glow of his coca wine. The air smelled faintly of cork, varnish, and the faint sweetness of Bordeaux. Dust motes drifted in the lamplight, and somewhere in the corner, the tick of a clock measured out the rhythm of progress. Mariani had learned that in the new age, invention alone was not enough. Beauty was its own advertisement. To conquer the hearts of Paris, his creation would need a body worthy of worship. So he began to design the bottle not as a container, but as an icon. He studied perfume flacons, champagne decanters, and the slim medicine vials that lined the apothecaries of the left bank. Each was elegant, but too narrow, too severe. He wanted warmth, something the hand would linger on. After weeks of sketches and prototypes, he settled on a curved silhouette, neither medicinal nor decadent, but balanced, inviting. The embossed letters curled along the glass like vines. Vin Mariani or Coca du Peru. Even the name seemed to breathe, flowing like the wine inside. When the first shipment arrived from the glassworks, he uncrated them one by one, running his thumb over the raised letters, listening to the soft chime of glass against glass. They gleamed like garnets in the sun. Each would be filled by hand, corked with care, and sealed with wax, the color of old roses. On the label, printed in gold leaf, was an image of an angel offering a chalice, a subtle signature, a nod to his own name. He wrote in his journal that day, "The bottle must inspire confidence. To drink is to believe." Across Paris, posters soon bloomed on the sides of buildings, a woman in silk lifting a glass of Mariani's wine beneath the words, "La force dans une bouteille," strength in a flac, bottle. The same design appeared in London, New York, and Madrid, the image spreading faster than the tonic itself. The bottle had become its own language, a symbol of refinement, of Parisian modernity, of faith in science disguised as pleasure. At night, Mariani walked along the boulevards, passing cafes where artists, soldiers, and clerks all drank from those same curved bottles. Some kept them long after they were empty, polishing the glass and setting it on mantels beside candlesticks and framed portraits. They glowed under lamplight, like relics of a new religion. Even royalty admired them. When the first case reached Windsor, it was said the Queen herself remarked on the bottle's grace before she ever tasted what it held. The elegance of its shape seemed to promise safety, an illusion no less intoxicating than the drink itself. In time, the bottles would outlast their maker, buried in cellars, preserved in attics, their labels browned and curling with age. But for now, in the heart of the 19th century, they gleamed with the confidence of an empire that believed beauty could sanctify anything, even addiction. As Mariani stood before the shelves of filled glass, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The bottles reflected him back 100 times over, rows of little red suns trapped in crystal. He raised one to the window, watching it catch the morning light, and whispered to himself, "Perfection is not in the wine, it is in how the world sees it." And outside, Paris continued to hum the city of art, of faith, of fatigue, unaware that its next miracle had already been bottled. The first whispers began in drawing rooms, carried not by merchants or newspapers, but by conversation, soft and gilded. "Have you tried the new tonic from Paris?" they asked behind fans and folded letters, their tones half curious, half conspiratorial. In an age where exhaustion was considered both fashionable and fatal, Vin Mariani became the most delicate of secrets, a cure that glittered. By the mid-1860s, the C0caine had made its way into the parlors of diplomats and duchesses, its crimson bottles hidden behind decanters of port and sherry. In Vienna, a baroness claimed it restored her nerves after the opera. In Madrid, an ambassador boasted it soothed his melancholy. Each glass poured was a gesture of both intimacy and superiority, a quiet claim that one was in touch with the latest refinement from the continent. The effect traveled faster than rumor. Within months, Mariani was sending shipments not only to physicians but to embassies. His crates, stamped with a gold leaf monogram, crossed borders as easily as gossip. In Rome, a cardinal sipped it before Mass and declared that it awakened the soul to prayer. In London, the wives of industrial magnates requested it by name, calling it the cordial that makes a woman radiant. Behind their powder and pearls, few knew how literal that radiance was. Pupils widened, blood quickened, laughter rising a note too high before the inevitable, dreamy calm. In Paris itself, the name Mariani became a password. To serve his wine was to demonstrate worldliness. To refuse it was to seem provincial. Even doctors, once cautious, now prescribed it without hesitation. Better than morphine, one wrote, and infinitely more agreeable. Pharmacies displayed the elegant bottle in their windows beside tonics for the lungs, the heart, the mind. Yet Vin Mariani was not sold as medicine. Not exactly. It was advertised as vitality itself, bottled and blessed by modern science. Late, one evening, at a salon in the Marais, a young physician recounted the story of Queen Victoria's latest illness, her weariness, her grief. Someone whispered that her physicians had written privately to Paris. "They have requested a case," the guest said, eyes bright with scandal. For the Queen. The room went still, and then came a flutter of excitement. If true, it meant the tonic had crossed into the most sacred sphere of influence, the British Crown itself. By candlelight, the conversation turned reverent. They spoke of Mariani as though he were not merely a chemist but a visionary, a man who had found a way to make strength itself drinkable. To some, he was the prophet of the modern age. To others, he was a magician who had learned to bottle sunlight and sell it by the case. In his Paris office, Mariani read the letters that followed, envelopes crested with wax seals, written in looping perfumed script, royal chambers, embassies, cathedrals, all asking for the same thing: more bottles, more life, more light. He smiled as he dictated his replies, the pen gliding easily over the paper. Outside, the carriages rolled toward the opera, their lanterns glinting on rain-slick streets. Inside them, passengers held parcels wrapped in velvet, the faint clink of glass beneath the folds. The whispers had become a current, moving quietly through Europe's veins. And somewhere between palace and parish, beneath the glitter and reverence, the first addiction of the modern world was beginning to breathe. The corridors of Windsor Castle were always quiet at dawn. The servants moved like shadows through halls of blue carpet and gilt frames, carrying silver trays and folded linens. Beyond the great windows, fog clung to the Thames, and the frost turned the lawns white as lace. Inside, the Queen did not sleep. Victoria's health had never been robust. Years of childbirth, mourning, and governance had left her body frail and her spirit restless. Since the death of Prince Albert, she lived more in silence than in speech. Her physicians called it melancholy of the Constitution, a polite way of naming grief that never left the bones. They prescribed tonics and teas, bitters and morphine tinctures, none of which revived the spark she once possessed. The empire still ran, vast and obedient, but its sovereign sat in dim rooms, pale and exhausted, her crown heavier with each year. So, when a letter arrived from a London physician, sealed and discreet, suggesting a new tonic from Paris, one that restores energy without agitation, the Queen's household did not dismiss it. The physician, Sir William Gull, was a man of impeccable standing, known for treating royalty with both science and subtlety. He had tested the tonic himself, he wrote, and found it a remarkable restorative of body and mind. The name was Vin Mariani. The first case arrived quietly through Dover, its wooden crate bearing no royal insignia, only a simple Parisian mark. Inside, 12 bottles glowed darkly against straw and tissue. The Queen's apothecary unwrapped one, held it to the light, and frowned. It looked more like fine claret than any medicine. But the instructions were clear: a glass in the morning and one at night, especially in times of sadness or fatigue. That evening, after supper, Victoria allowed herself a small measure. The taste surprised her, soft, sweet, with a curious brightness beneath. Within minutes, the room seemed lighter. The fire glowed more warmly, her thoughts grew clearer, and a strange calm unfolded through her limbs. For the first time in weeks, her mind wandered without ache. She felt, faintly, like herself again. Over the following days, her appetite returned. She walked the halls more often, wrote longer letters, and even smiled at her ladies-in-waiting. The court physicians were astonished. "Her Majesty has recovered her strength," Gull reported, "without the opiates that so dull the faculties." He ordered another case. But the change was not without consequence. On nights when the Queen could not sleep, she asked for another glass. On mornings after difficult correspondence, she drank too. The tonic's effects were subtle, but certain, an invisible thread tightening her resolve and quickening her pulse. Her ladies began calling it the cordial of clarity. At Balmoral, she recommended it to visiting princes and duchesses. In letters to her eldest daughter in Germany, she wrote of a most excellent, restorative, quite unlike any I have taken before. Soon, bottles appeared on royal sideboards across Europe, each one identical, each one filled with the same scarlet glow that had lifted a grieving monarch. In Paris, Angelo Mariani read the news with satisfaction. He had never met the Queen, yet her endorsement, whispered, discreet yet unmistakable, transformed his tonic into legend. For if the weary ruler of the greatest empire on earth drank Vin Mariani, then surely it was not indulgence, but faith in the modern age. And so, behind the stone walls of Windsor, in a crystal glass that caught the last light of evening, a new ritual began. One sip for composure, one for courage. The Queen's secret was no longer sorrow, but the quiet, crimson comfort of coca wine, the empire's most elegant addiction, dressed as grace. In Rome, the air itself seemed older, heavy with incense, dust, and the echo of centuries. The Vatican bell tolled the hour as sunlight spilled through stained glass and gilded every curve of marble. Inside his private study, Pope Leo XIII sat surrounded by books, letters, and the smell of ink. His hands trembled when he wrote now. Age had settled into his bones like cold stone. Yet his mind, restless and bright, refused to dim. He sought a miracle not of heaven, but of science, a remedy to keep his strength while the world beyond the walls of the Holy See changed faster than any prayer could follow. It was his secretary, Monseigneur Jouin, who brought him the first bottle. "From Paris, Your Holiness," he said softly, placing it upon the desk. "The chemist's name is Mariani. It is said to give vigor to the weary, without sin to the soul." The Pope smiled faintly at the phrasing. There was no shortage of elixirs in Rome. Pilgrims carried them, apothecaries hawked them, but few came endorsed by the courts of Europe. He lifted the bottle. The label glimmered with golden letters. Vin tonic Mariani au coca du Peru. That evening, as the light faded to amber across the Tiber, Leo XIII allowed himself a small glass. The taste was gentler than expected, deep and warm, like communion wine touched by summer fruit. Within minutes, a clarity rose through him, subtle but unmistakable. The aches in his fingers eased, the weight behind his eyes lifted. He found himself reading again, the words on the page sharp and alive. "Deo gratias," he murmured, half in wonder, half in relief. The following morning, he felt light enough to walk through the gardens without assistance. The cardinals noted it first, the steadier voice, the spark in his gaze. The Pope began to speak more often of endurance, of divine energy, of the mysterious harmony between faith and human invention. He drank a glass before each Mass, and another before addressing the faithful, from his balcony. The servants learned to leave the bottle beside his writing desk, its cork loosened, its color glowing like sanctified blood in the lamplight. Word, as it always did, spread. When journalists from L'Osservatore Romano visited the Vatican Library, they noticed the label on the table and whispered. Within weeks, the story reached Paris. His Holiness drinks Vin Mariani daily. Mariani seized the moment with the precision of a man who understood both chemistry and faith. A poster appeared soon after. The Pope himself seated serenely holding a glass of the tonic beneath a halo of gold. The caption read, "God blesses the gifts that sustain his children." No other endorsement could have carried such weight. Orders poured in from convents, monasteries, and missions. Priests prescribed it to the infirm. Bishops toasted with it before sermons. Mariani, ever cautious, sent free crates to the Vatican each year, along with a handwritten note in Latin thanking the Holy Father for his divine encouragement. In the stillness of evening, the aging Pope sometimes reflected on the irony. The Church had once condemned the alchemists for trying to bottle divine power. Now, in this new century, he himself drank from their legacy. The wine eased his pain, yes, but more than that. It allowed him to believe, if only for an hour, that faith and progress might yet coexist. When he died years later, a nearly empty bottle of Vin Mariani remained on his table, the wax seal broken, a faint scent of coca and Bordeaux lingering in the air. The chemist in Paris would frame that very label in his office, gilded in reverence, and call it what it truly was, a benediction in glass. By the turn of the 1870s, Vin Mariani had become more than a tonic. It was an emblem of progress, of faith in chemistry, of the illusion that fatigue itself could be conquered by elegance. From Paris to New York, from the Vatican to the House of Windsor, the same bottle appeared like a passport to modernity, curved, golden, and filled with the same deep red liquid that seemed to shimmer with promise. Angelo Mariani's workshop had long outgrown Rue de Clichy. His new establishment, on the Boulevard Haussmann, looked less like a laboratory and more like a cathedral to glass and light. Shelves rose to the ceiling, lined with thousands of bottles stacked like stained glass windows. The air smelled of cork and Bordeaux, of oak crates and faint spice. Clerks moved briskly among the aisles, packing shipments bound for every corner of the civilized world. Each crate bore the same elegant emblem Mariani. Paris pressed into the wood like a royal seal. Mariani himself worked quietly behind his desk, the son of a Corsican tailor who had somehow become the supplier to kings, queens, and popes. On the wall hung portraits of his most devoted admirers, the Queen of Spain, the Prince of Wales, the actor Sarah Bernhardt, the explorer Ferdinand de Lesseps. Letters framed in gilt thanked him for restored strength and joy. In the newspapers, his advertisements gleamed beside announcements of new telegraphs, new railways, new miracles of science. And in every one of them, that same phrase appeared, endorsed by the world's greatest minds. Doctors swore by it. Artists worshipped it. Soldiers carried it in their packs. Missionaries brought it into jungles and deserts, where it was praised as divine fortification. In Parisian hospitals, nurses poured it for patients recovering from fevers. In the drawing rooms of London, ladies drank it between courses. In New York's Fifth Avenue pharmacies, it was sold beside quinine and cough syrup. Vin Mariani was no longer a luxury, it was a necessity, as familiar as perfume, as trusted as prayer. Each bottle told the same quiet story. It began with the first sip, the warmth that rose in the chest, the color that returned to the cheeks, the sudden light behind the eyes. The weary clerk stayed late at his desk. The seamstress finished one more gown. The composer worked through the night, convinced that inspiration itself had been bottled by a Frenchman with steady hands and divine ambition. Yet the bottle also carried another story, quieter still. Some began to notice the restless dreams, the sleepless nights, the pulse that never slowed. A London physician recorded that his patient's hands shook after months of use. A Paris actress confessed she could no longer perform without it. But such murmurs drowned easily beneath the music of progress. To question Vin Mariani was to question the century itself. In the cafes and salons of Europe, where smoke curled above laughter and lamplight shimmered on marble, the bottles gleamed like jewels. They clinked in royal carriages and monasteries alike. The sound became the rhythm of an era, soft, confident, eternal, and in his Paris office, Angelo Mariani would sometimes pause among the noise of commerce, listening to the faint glass-on-glass echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He would smile, light his lamp, and think, not without pride, that the 19th century itself now ran on the color of his wine. A century after Angelo Mariani's death, the color red still lingered faintly, invisibly in the bloodstream of modern life. It pulsed in advertisements, in vending machines, in the jittering hands of commuters clutching coffee cups and energy drinks. The label had changed, the chemistry refined, the guilt forgotten. Yet beneath every promise of focus, every jolt of caffeine or sugar, lived a ghost of that first bottle, glowing quietly in the background of the human story. The world no longer called it Vin Mariani, but its spirit remained a crimson memory disguised as progress. In Paris, the Musée d'Histoire de la Médecine still kept one of the last surviving bottles under glass. It sat at the far end of a dim hallway, between a case of 19th century opium vials and a display of early X-ray plates. Tourists passed it with only brief curiosity. They read the small placard, Vin tonic Mariani au Coca du Peru, circa 1890, and moved on. Yet, sometimes, one visitor would pause longer, gaze at the dusty bottle, and see more than relic or curiosity. They would see the reflection of a world that had once believed salvation could be poured into a glass. Every decade, someone would try to resurrect it. In the 1960s, a French vintner released a tribute wine, its label embossed with a portrait of Mariani himself, smiling faintly like a ghost returning to his stage. It sold poorly. In the 1990s, an American entrepreneur launched a so-called energy wine made from herbal extracts and vitamins, promising power without poison. It was a failure too, though the irony was lost on no one. The red thread of the old tonic could not be cut. It simply reappeared, repackaged, rebranded, ready for the next century's hunger. Today, the red of Mariani's bottle survives in the logos of global corporations, in the glow of vending machines, in the thin buzz that hums behind every modern ambition. Humanity, no longer drinks its energy, it absorbs it. Screens flicker through the night, factories hum, markets never close. The promise of endless wakefulness once whispered from the lips of a French chemist has become civilization's unspoken creed. And still, the world grows tired. Scholars occasionally write about Vin Mariani as the first truly modern product, a union of faith, science, and advertising. They call it the ancestor of both medicine and marketing, the hinge between alchemy and consumerism. But few notice what Mariani himself might have understood in the end, that every miracle of endurance carries its own exhaustion within it, that every bright flame casts the shadow of its eventual ash. In the museum, when the lights are low and the halls grow still, the bottle seems to hold its own dim glow not from electricity, but from memory. A faint red shimmer moves through the liquid, catching the last breath of the room's silence. If one leans close enough, they might imagine the faintest echo of clinking glasses, the murmur of salons, the promise repeated again and again. La force dans une bouteille. And yet, standing there, surrounded by the artifacts of progress, scalpels, syringes, pills and wires, it becomes clear that Mariani's dream never truly ended. It merely expanded until it filled the world. Outside, Paris glitters with the same fevered light that once reflected on his crimson glass. The air hums with caffeine, ambition, and fatigue. The century still runs on his illusion. The belief that energy is infinite, that progress can outrun its own shadow, that one more sip will be enough. But in the museum's quiet, the truth remains, sealed in glass. The wine has darkened, the label has faded, and yet the world still drinks. It always will. Across the Atlantic, where the streets of New York already glowed with electric light and ambition, the ghost of Vin Mariani found new life. The century that had buried the French chemist's creation did not bury his idea. It simply changed its accent, its sweetness, and its name. America, still young and unshaken by the moral hangover of Europe, inherited the dream of bottled vitality and turned it into business. In Atlanta, Georgia, a wounded Confederate veteran and pharmacist named John Pemberton studied Mariani's advertisements and saw both inspiration and opportunity. He had tasted Vin Mariani once in his life during a visit to a physician in New Orleans and never forgotten the rush of lucidity it gave him. But by the 1880s, America's temperance movement had made wine suspect. Pemberton wanted the same clarity, the same promise, but without the sin of alcohol. So, in a small brass kettle behind his drugstore, he began to experiment coca leaves, cola, nuts, sugar, and a dash of caramel. He called it Pemberton's French wine coca, a name borrowed shamelessly from Mariani's own. A valuable tonic for the brain and nerves, the label promised. For a while, it sold modestly until Prohibition reached Georgia in 1886, and Pemberton was forced to remove the wine. He replaced it with carbonated water and sugar syrup. The formula survived, the intoxication shifted. Thus was born Coca-Cola, a name so deceptively simple that few realized its lineage. Across America, soda fountains replaced apothecaries as temples of renewal. Instead of marble counters lined with vials and tinctures, there were polished chrome spigots and glass cups filled with fizzing brown sweetness. Clerks called themselves soda jerks, but they were the new priests of the century's secular faith. People came not for medicine, but for mood. It was no longer about curing fatigue, it was about forgetting it. By the 1890s, the Brady 1890s, Coca-Cola Company had eclipsed its French ancestor entirely. Vin Mariani still graced the drawing rooms of Europe, but in America, the future wore bubbles and a smile. The tonic that had once required papal blessing now needed only a nickel. Its advertisements echoed Mariani's own, promising life, energy, and cheer. The faces were no longer queens and popes, but baseball players and debutantes, their joy brighter, their faith shallower. The irony was rich. Mariani's downfall had come from purity laws, yet his ghost flourished in a land where sweetness and speed were virtues. Cocaine itself was soon outlawed. But the rhythm of stimulation remained. The Americans had learned to refine desire, not to silence it, but to disguise it. The new century would not drink its miracles in crimson glass, but sip them through straws. In Paris, a decade later, an aging journalist visited a soda fountain in Manhattan and marveled at the sight. Children laughing over drinks that had once been the preserve of empires. "They have taken Mariani's spirit," he wrote, "and made it eternal. The world will never sleep again." He was right. The American inheritance was not the wine itself, but the idea behind it that the human heart could be bottled, branded, and sold, one sip at a time. And as the century roared to life with cars, jazz, and neon, the fizz of the new world drowned out the silence of the old. The chemist's dream had crossed the ocean, shed its guilt, and learned to smile, sugar-coated, carbonated, and endless. Across the Channel, in the soot-dark heart of London, the chemists had learned to listen to the rhythm of profit. The city never slept, and neither did its laboratories. By the year 1888, Vin Mariani had become not only the talk of society, but the envy of every apothecary who had ever lifted a beaker. The name Mariani glittered across advertisements in the London Illustrated News, and the city's pharmacists, practical men, not dreamers, saw in that red bottle a fortune waiting to be replicated. It began quietly, with imitation. A bottle of Mariani's wine sold for 4 shillings, too dear for the factory worker, too elegant for the poor. So the chemists of Whitechapel, Soho, and Fleet Street began mixing their own concoctions. They boiled cheap claret, crushed imported coca leaves, and added sugar or opium depending on their clientele. The labels came later, hand-printed and self-assured. Coca Bordeaux, Queen's Restorative Wine, Euphoric Cordial, of Peru. The names were numerous, the colors nearly identical. To the untrained eye, they all shimmered with the same promise: health in a bottle, modernity for the masses. In the back room of one shop on Farringdon Road, a young assistant named Thomas Lyle spent his evenings perfecting his employer's imitation. The floor smelled of alcohol and crushed leaves. He stirred the mixture with a long glass rod, watching as the deep red swirled under lamplight. "A little more coca," his master instructed. "They like to feel it." The phrase echoed in his ears long after the bottles were corked. Within a year, London was awash in cheap imitations. Clerks and seamstresses drank them after work. Soldiers bought them before shipping off to India, and women slipped them into their tea in the belief it steadied the nerves. Each label bore the Queen's likeness or the Pope's blessing, borrowed freely and illegally from Mariani's own posters. The chemists grew rich, and the public grew restless, thin, bright-eyed, and dependent. The medical journals began to take notice. The Lancet published a cautious warning: coca wines of dubious manufacture now appear in every district. Though advertised as tonics, their use in excess excites the pulse and disquiets the mind. But few read past the headline. Those who did dismissed it as the fear-mongering of jealous rivals. Mariani's own agents in London tried to intervene. They wrote to the newspapers, denouncing the counterfeits as dangerous, impure. But imitation had become too profitable to stop. In the East End, a labourer could buy a small bottle for a penny, cheaper than beer, more reliable than bread. The city drank itself awake. By night, the glow of the gas lamps reflected in puddles that looked faintly red, as if the streets themselves had taken on the colour of coca and wine. In the basement of his shop, young Thomas Lyle began keeping one bottle aside for himself. It steadied his hands at first. Then, slowly, it made them shake. He told himself it was exhaustion. Everyone was tired. Everyone was drinking something to feel less so. And in the counting houses of London, where merchants added their profits under the flicker of lamplight, none saw the irony that the empire which once prided itself on conquering the world was now quietly being conquered by a bottle. Its subjects ruled not by crown or creed, but by chemistry. At the heart of every palace, behind the gilt doors and velvet corridors, there existed a quieter kingdom, one ruled not by monarchs, but by bottles. The royal pharmacy was a world of polished wood, lined with rows of elixirs and tonics that glittered beneath the low gaslight. The air smelled faintly of lavender, mercury, and wine. It was the scent of privilege carefully disguised as medicine. In Windsor, the Queen's personal apothecary, Mr. James Collier, moved silently between the shelves each morning. He was a small, discreet man, with ink-stained fingers and a mind full of labels and dosages. His duties were both practical and sacred, to preserve the health of the royal body upon which the empire rested. Within the drawers lay powders from India, salts from the East, tinctures from Germany, and, now, bottles from Paris. Vin Mariani, a gift from Her Majesty's physician, Sir William Gull. The bottle stood in its own niche, its label gleaming softly beneath the lamplight. For Her Majesty's personal use, the tag read in careful handwriting. It was not kept with the morphine vials or the laudanum, nor even among the imported teas. It sat instead near the cordials and fine brandies, a placement that said everything about its nature. Vin Mariani was not a drug. It was refinement. Each morning, before breakfast, Collier prepared a small glass. The Queen preferred it chilled, with 1 lump of sugar, served in cut crystal. On difficult days, when official correspondence brought troubling news or when her breath came short from grief, she would request another in the evening, for steadiness. Her ladies-in-waiting noted the pattern quietly. On nights when she drank, she spoke more, smiled more, wrote longer letters in a firmer hand. Word of the royal restorative spread through the household, though never by official decree. Footmen whispered it to cooks, who whispered it to visiting courtiers. Her Majesty takes the French tonic, they said, the one that restores the nerves. Soon, courtiers began requesting their own bottles from London chemists, who were only too eager to oblige. A year later, the same wine appeared on the tables of dukes, bishops, and foreign envoys, each glass raised in the Queen's unspoken endorsement. Across the Channel, Angelo Mariani heard the rumors and smiled. He had never received a direct letter from Windsor, but he didn't need one. He commissioned a new advertisement, a tasteful image of a crowned silhouette, lifting a glass beneath the words, "Favored in the highest circles." It ran in every major European newspaper. Meanwhile, in the royal pharmacy, Collier began noticing the empty bottles accumulating faster than before. At first, 1 every 2 weeks, then 1 a week. He said nothing, of course. Silence was part of his profession, but sometimes, when he restocked the cabinet late at night, he wondered what it meant that even monarchs, those who ruled over millions, needed their strength poured from a bottle. The Queen's private physician continued to insist the wine was harmless, a mild stimulant, he said, nothing more. But Collier had seen the tremor in her fingers when she signed documents, the restless tapping of her ring against the table. He told himself it was grief, not chemistry. In the evenings, when the castle grew still, the apothecary would pause before locking the door, his gaze lingering on the bottles lined in their perfect order, red glass glowing like captured sunset. Outside, the empire stretched across oceans. Inside, its sovereign solace came from the quiet burn of coca and Bordeaux. The royal pharmacy slept under lock and key, but the secret within it had already escaped, flowing down marble corridors and across oceans, whispered from servant to sailor, from court to colony. What began as a prescription had become something far larger, a ritual of the powerful, a symbol of endurance, and a reflection of an age that would rather medicate its sorrow than name it. By the closing years of the 19th century, Angelo Mariani's empire had begun to crack, not loudly, but with the quiet inevitability of glass under strain. The world that had once worshipped him now spoke his name with caution, or not at all. In his offices on Boulevard Haussmann, where clerks once hurried through clouds of paper and perfume, the air had grown stale. The ledgers, once overflowing with orders, now carried long gaps between entries. The phone seldom rang, and when it did, it was usually from a lawyer. Mariani still arrived each morning, punctual as habit. His hair had turned white, his suit hung looser on his frame, but his posture remained immaculate, a soldier of science refusing to surrender. He walked the factory floor, touching each vat as he passed, as if reassurance could be exchanged through skin and steel. "They will come back," he told his foreman. "The world is fickle, but fatigue is eternal." The foreman nodded, but his eyes were tired. Half the workers had been dismissed that spring. The lawsuits came next. A German competitor accused him of falsifying medical endorsements. A London distributor sued for losses after counterfeit scandals decimated sales. Even in Paris, where once he had been lionized as the chemist of vitality, the public mood had turned. The cafes that had once toasted Vin Mariani now served coca-free restoratives and mocked the old tonic in their posters. The modern drinker wanted purity, not the ghosts of indulgence. Worse still were the scientific condemnations. Medical journals that had once praised his discovery now cited studies linking coca to nervous excitability and physical dependence. His defenders were few, and even they spoke in the past tense. The age of glamour had shifted to the age of regulation. Laboratories were now inspected by the state, Ingredients required certificates. The modern chemist, once a magician, was now a bureaucrat. Mariani tried to adapt. He launched a new version of his tonic, less coca, more caffeine. He called it Mariani's restorative wine, refined formula. The advertisements featured landscapes instead of faces, flowers instead of testimonials. But the world had moved on. Coca had become a cautionary word, its allure curdled into suspicion. His factory continued to operate, but at a fraction of its former glory. At night, he sat in his office, surrounded by the framed letters that had once defined his life. The Queen, the Pope, Edison, Verne, their signatures gleamed faintly in the lamplight, relics of a time when chemistry had been divine. He sometimes traced their handwriting with his fingertip, as though the ink could still transmit faith. When reporters visited, hoping for a confession or an apology, he received them politely. "I gave the world what it wanted," he told one. "It is not my fault. The world no longer knows what that is." In his final years, he kept one unopened bottle of the original, Vin Mariani, on his desk. The liquid inside had darkened to the color of rust, but he never threw it away. It was no longer medicine, nor luxury, it was memory. Bottled and sealed, he died quietly in his home in Corsica, far from the factories and laboratories that had once made his name immortal. The newspapers printed small obituaries. Some called him a pioneer, others a charlatan. None denied that he had changed the world, only that the world had since changed back. In Paris, the last of his workers locked the factory doors and blew out the lamps. The silence that followed was thick with ghosts of bottles clinking, of laughter echoing, of promises poured and drunk to the dregs. And somewhere in the city, behind the fogged glass of an old apothecary, a single dusty bottle still glowed faintly red beneath the gaslight, as if remembering a time when the future itself had come in liquid form. By the dawn of the 1880s, exhaustion had become a mark of status. The greater one's fatigue, the higher one's importance, or so the world seemed to believe. The industrial age moved faster than any century before it. Steamships roared, telegraphs screamed, and clocks ruled the rhythm of human life with mechanical precision. Sleep was now an inconvenience, rest an outdated luxury, and into this sleepless world flowed Vin Mariani, as natural and necessary as breath. From the glittering halls of London to the dusty ports of Bombay, from the Arctic expeditions to the deserts of North Africa, its curved bottles traveled farther than any sermon or song. Aboard every ocean liner, crates were stacked beside champagne and quinine. Soldiers carried it in their packs, beside rifles and maps. Missionaries drank it under cathedral shade. Explorers beneath canvas tents. The label promised vitality, and for those who lived by duty, that promise felt divine. "Fatigue," wrote a divine London columnist, "is no longer an affliction, it is a choice for the weak." And Mariani's tonic became the unspoken badge of the strong. It appeared on the desks of prime ministers, in the pockets of doctors, and on the nightstands of actresses. Even the Vatican, ever cautious with earthly pleasures, ordered regular shipments labeled for clerical use. In New York, the drink arrived like a storm. Its crimson bottles gleamed behind pharmacy windows along Fifth Avenue, the name Mariani painted in looping gold on every awning. Newspapers praised it as the new elixir of civilization. Doctors wrote prescriptions for businessmen suffering excess of mental labor. Mothers gave it to their children for school fatigue. Its use spread faster than the telegraph wires that sang overhead. For the first time in history, the world believed it had conquered tiredness. The old rhythms of night and day, of labor and rest, began to blur. Clerks worked until midnight by gaslight. Journalists wrote until dawn. Artists painted until their hands cramped, whispering that Mariani's wine keeps the muses awake. The streets of Paris glowed long past midnight, full of faces too bright, too alive. And yet, beneath the brilliance, something subtle began to shift. People spoke faster, tempers shortened, appetite waned. A strange, quiet dependency settled into the bloodstream of society. The human body, once guided by nature, now danced to the tempo of industry, and Vin Mariani played the rhythm. At his factory on Boulevard Haussmann, Angelo Mariani stood before his workers as barrels of Bordeaux were rolled in, and the scent of coca filled the air. He had built an empire of vitality, its lifeblood bottled in glass. Watching his employees move with tireless precision, he felt a thrill of pride. The world no longer feared fatigue, it had banished it. But at night, when he walked home along the glittering boulevards, he noticed how the light never dimmed anymore, how the city seemed always awake, always wanting. The silence between gas lamps felt thinner than before, as though the world itself had forgotten how to rest. He told himself it was progress, that endless motion was proof of life. But deep down, even he began to sense it, that a century which refused to sleep would one day have to dream in other ways. And when that dream came, it would not be gentle. By the final years of the 19th century, the world seemed to hum. Cities glowed with the new light of invention, wires strung like veins through the air, lamps burning where once there had been stars, telegraphs sang in metal tongues, and locomotives shrieked like living things. Humanity had plugged itself into its own creation and refused to sleep. They called it the Electric Age, and Vin Mariani became its unofficial current. The parallels were irresistible. Electricity illuminated, Mariani's wine invigorated. Both promised a brighter, faster, tireless world. The same men who wired continents by day uncorked bottles of coca wine by night to steady their hands and quicken their thoughts. Advertisements caught the mood perfectly. For the modern mind, the spark in the veins. In the illustrations, lightning forked across the page, striking the bottle, which glowed like a heart. In New York, businessmen drank it before board meetings. In Vienna, composers sipped it before orchestras thundered to life. Even the scientists who studied the mysteries of electricity used it to stay awake through their long nights of calculation. Thomas Edison, ever the showman, was said to have kept a bottle at his laboratory, calling it the finest fuel for invention. The quote appeared in every newspaper Mariani could reach. He did not care whether Edison had truly said it. The public did. Paris itself became a live wire. The Exposition Universelle of 1889, the Great World's Fair, opened with fireworks, engines, and fountains of light. Visitors thronged the boulevards, dazzled by the sight of the Eiffel Tower, rising against the night like a spear of steel and flame. In the pavilions, Vin Mariani was served beside champagne and mineral water, offered as a taste of the future. "It is not wine," said a visitor from Boston. "It is electricity in liquid form." Angelo Mariani walked through the exhibition that summer, his hat in hand, his expression modest but triumphant. He passed displays of dynamo machines and incandescent bulbs, listening to the murmur of languages and the clink of glasses. His creation was everywhere, in the cafes, the theaters, the hotels. Men toasted progress with the same confidence they once reserved for God. But the energy that filled the air was not the serene light of reason. It was feverish, trembling, hungry. The century's faith in invention had no limits and no brakes. People spoke of the conquest of nature, of the triumph of human will, and drank accordingly. No one paused to ask whether a body, like a wire, could burn out. In the years that followed, doctors began to notice an epidemic of sleeplessness among their patients, businessmen, writers, and young women of leisure who claimed they could not rest without their nightcap of coca wine. The same journalists who praised the modern world's brilliance began to complain of the tyranny, exhaustion. The cure and the sickness had become indistinguishable. Still, the lights never went out. The factories roared, the trains screamed, and the people of the electric age glowed like the filaments that lit their cities, beautiful, tireless, and burning from within. Mariani, now a man of wealth and renown, returned each night to his laboratory on Boulevard Haussmann. He would pour himself a small glass, raise it to the lamplight, and watch the reflections spark in the crimson depths. In that glow he saw the world he had helped to make bright, brilliant and humming with energy. He could not yet see, or would not admit, that it was already beginning to overheat. Outside, Paris flickered like a giant heart alive, radiant, unstoppable, beating to the rhythm of wine and wire. Invention and addiction, progress and fatigue. The century's pulse had never been stronger, nor closer to breaking. By the late 1880s, a strange hunger haunted Europe, not for food, but for motion. People no longer ate to live, but drank to keep going. The city's stomach had changed. Its appetite was for energy alone. Vin Mariani had woven itself into every pulse of modern life, filling the void between meals, between thoughts, between breaths. It promised strength, but quietly replaced nourishment with craving. In the cafes, plates went untouched while the glasses emptied. Students who once filled notebooks now filled their veins with coca wine. They said it cleared the mind, sharpened memory, made the intellect feel infinite. But their faces grew thinner, their eyes more hollow, their laughter stretched too long and ended too abruptly. A painter in Montparnasse bragged that he could work 3 days without food, living only on Mariani's tonic and cigarettes. He died at 29, still clutching his brush. The obituary said he had worked himself to death. Even among Blangzide, the wealthy appetite became unfashionable. Society women sipped their morning tonic instead of breakfast. "It keeps one light," they said, smiling with lips that trembled faintly. They no longer fainted in parlors, they glowed instead, as if illuminated from within. Doctors praised their delicate equilibrium, unaware it was the equilibrium of a candle burning too fast. In London, clerks carried small flasks of the wine in their pockets. One glass at noon, another before the long train ride home. "It keeps the mind sharp," wrote a columnist in the Illustrated Times, and the conversation lively. But behind closed doors, wives whispered of husbands who no longer slept, who paced the floor until dawn with restless eyes. In Paris, Angelo Mariani could feel the rhythm of his city changing. Production at his factory doubled, then tripled. The scent of coca and wine seeped into the very stones of Boulevard Haussmann. Yet he noticed something unsettling his own. Appetite waned. Meals grew smaller, his stomach lighter. He told himself it was the mark of productivity, of a man too busy to eat. Each morning, he drank a small glass to begin his day. Each night, another to calm his mind. The line between necessity and habit had long since blurred. Visitors to his laboratory saw a man of boundless energy, eyes bright, movements quick, thoughts darting like sparks. "Monsieur Mariani never tires," one journalist wrote. "He is the very embodiment of his invention." The words were meant as praise. They read like prophecy. Meanwhile, in hospitals, a quiet confusion began to spread. Patients complained of racing hearts, sleeplessness, and an inexplicable loss of hunger. Physicians noted that Vin Mariani was no longer curing exhaustion, but creating it, that every burst of vitality was borrowed from tomorrow. "It awakens," said one doctor, "but it does not nourish." The truth was whispered, but not printed. The public did not want warnings. It wanted miracles. And Mariani's miracle had become a necessity too sacred to question. By the decade's end, Paris seemed to move without pause, a city that never sat down, never drew breath, never rested. Its people, thin and brilliant and trembling, mistook their frenzy for health. They thought themselves ascending, when in truth they were starving not for food, but for stillness. And at the center of it all, beneath the hum of gas lamps and the endless rhythm of hooves and wheels, thousands of bottles glowed in unison, red, radiant, and emptying too fast. By the middle of the 1870s, Angelo Mariani's desk had become a shrine to praise. Every morning, his secretary carried in a new stack of envelopes, cream, ivory, or pale blue, sealed with wax crests or monograms, scented faintly of perfume and travel. They came from all over the world. Opera houses, palaces, universities, hospitals, and expedition camps deep in Africa and the Amazon. Each letter spoke of the same thing: wonder. He read them slowly, savoring the rhythm of admiration. "Your tonic has given me back my voice. wrote the actress Sarah Bernhardt in her ornate, swooping hand. "I no longer faint beneath the lights." Another came from Jules Verne, claiming that Vin Mariani stirs the imagination more faithfully than any muse. A bishop from Madrid wrote that it warms the heart without sin. Even Thomas Edison, the prophet of electricity, sent word that the coca wine banishes exhaustion in the long nights of invention. Mariani kept them all, arranging them into albums bound in dark leather. Each page bore a photograph or a signature, framed like a relic. His study on Boulevard Haussmann soon resembled a museum of modern faith, portraits of men and women who shaped the age, all united by the same devotion. A glass of his crimson wine. Visitors were astonished. They whispered as they passed the framed letters. "It is like the Vatican of science," one journalist remarked. "Every saint of progress is here." He took particular pride in one letter, written on thick cream paper bearing the seal of Windsor Castle. It thanked him, in careful handwriting, for the comfort afforded to Her Majesty in recent months. The wording was formal, but the meaning clear. The Queen herself had written it, or at least dictated it. Mariani had it placed at the center of his wall, illuminated by a small brass lamp. Each evening, he stood before it with quiet satisfaction, as if bowing before his own creation. To the world, Vin Mariani had become more than a drink. It was the signature of modern success. Writers kept bottles at their desks beside their pens. Explorers carried it into jungles and ice fields, swearing it kept their hearts steady and their limbs strong. Doctors claimed it restored patients too weary to be cured. Politicians toasted treaties with it, calling it the wine of civilization. Every letter carried its own little echo of belief, a reminder that people no longer prayed to the heavens for strength, but to the chemist in Paris who had bottled it. Mariani never grew tired of their gratitude. He read the letters aloud to his assistants, chuckling at the more extravagant praise, then filed them neatly into his growing archive. Sometimes, late at night, when the street outside his office had gone still, he would open one of the albums and flip through the pages, the paper whispering like a hymn. There was Bernhardt, radiant in her stage costume, Verne, stern and visionary, a cardinal lifting a glass beneath the words Ad Majorem Dei Gloriam, all of them caught in that strange new communion between science and sensation. What Mariani could not see or would not admit was that behind every glowing signature lay a hidden dependency, the actress who could no longer perform without it, the author who wrote through the night only to collapse at dawn, the explorer who returned home with trembling hands. Each letter, each portrait, was both gratitude and confession, printed in ink that would one day fade. But in this golden moment, none of that mattered. To drink Vin Mariani was to belong to the age, to be modern, enlightened, tireless, and as the world's greatest names wrote his name in their own hand, Angelo Mariani believed, with perfect conviction, that history itself was signing its approval in red. By the mid-1880s, the world seemed almost drunk on its own vitality. Cities pulsed with industry and light. Trains thundered, newspapers multiplied, factories burned through the night. The public no longer spoke of rest, only renewal. To be tired was to be left behind. And in this age of ceaseless motion, Vin Mariani had become the cure for being human. Its advertisements painted a portrait of health so radiant that people began to mistake excitement for wellness. Posters showed glowing cheeks, shining eyes, and smiles that bordered on divine teens. Energy, not intoxication, the motto read, but those who drank it daily felt something far closer to rapture than health. They spoke quickly, thought faster, slept less. The body hummed like a machine, and for a few blissful hours each day, the illusion was complete. In the cafes of Paris, one could watch the miracle at work. A banker, pale from sleepless nights, lifted his glass and laughed too loudly at nothing. A mother, cheeks flushed from her morning dose, declared she had never felt more alive. Artists boasted they could work for days without fatigue, their hands moving faster than their minds could follow. They mistook the trembling in their fingers for inspiration. Doctors still endorsed the wine with confidence. The journals called it a triumph of modern chemistry, vigor without vice. Hospitals stocked it beside morphine and ether, prescribing it to the anxious, the bereaved, the ambitious. The line between remedy and indulgence blurred until it vanished entirely. Even the priests who condemned alcohol's moral corruption praised Vin Mariani for its purity of purpose. But the city had begun to change. Beneath the brilliance, the pace quickened to something feverish. More people walked with hurried steps, their eyes too bright, their laughter too sharp. In the mornings, the air in the cafes carried a faint metallic tension, a collective heartbeat racing just beyond comfort. And as quickly as the tonic elevated, it also receded, leaving behind a hush of unease. The drinkers would reach again for the bottle, before the light dimmed, before the body remembered what it meant to be tired. One evening, in a physician's office on the Boulevard Saint-Germain, a patient collapsed mid-conversation. Her pulse fluttered like wings, her pupils were wide and dark. When she recovered, she wept with gratitude for the doctor's heavenly elixir. He said nothing, simply poured her another measure and wrote "continue" as before in his ledger. He, too, had taken his morning dose. His hands shook as he signed the note. Angelo Mariani, meanwhile, could hardly keep pace with his own success. He was now as much myth as man, the benevolent magician of modern life. Yet even he noticed the small, unnerving patterns in the letters that arrived daily. "It no longer works as before," wrote one actress. "I require more. I feel my heart beat too, strongly," confessed a priest. Others simply stopped writing. Still, the world did not slow. No one wished to question the tonic that had made them tireless. The illusion of health had become its own necessity, a collective hallucination bottled and blessed by progress. At night, when the lamps dimmed and the streets fell quiet, the city finally breathed again. But it was a shallow breath, quick and uncertain, the breath of a patient who does not yet know they are ill. By the time the first decade of the new century closed, Vin Mariani was no longer a product, it was a memory, fading like perfume from an empty room. The name that had once electrified Europe had become a whisper uttered only by those old enough to remember its glow. In pharmacies, the last bottles gathered dust behind glass, their labels curling with age, their red contents turned brown. When clerks came across them during inventory, they sighed, noted them as obsolete, and moved on. Angelo Mariani was gone, and with him, the faith that invention alone could redeem fatigue. His successors tried to keep the company alive, reformulating the tonic without coca, but the public had no appetite for imitation. What they had loved was not the taste, nor even the relief, it was the promise. And once the promise soured, no substitute could revive it. In Paris, posters that once depicted radiant women raising glasses toward the light were scraped from walls to make room for advertisements of new marvels: electric appliances, motor cars, wireless telegraphs. The city no longer wanted elixirs, it wanted speed. Vin Mariani, with its genteel elegance and ornate script, belonged to another century, an age that believed salvation could be bottled, that modernity could be sweet and slow. The new century was faster, louder, less patient. The company's final warehouse sale took place in 1913. Crates of unused glassware, corks, and labeling machines were auctioned to other bottlers. A few loyal patrons, mostly older physicians, bought the remaining stock. For sentiment, one explained to the clerk. For the shelf, he smiled, though his hands trembled slightly as he signed the receipt. That night, he uncorked one of the bottles and poured a glass, not for health, but remembrance. The taste was still there, faint, dusty, like the echo of laughter in an empty theater. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a new empire of drink was rising. In the soda fountains of America, chemists in waistcoats mixed syrup, carbonation, and sugar into bright, effervescent beverages that promised joy without intoxication. The age of stimulants had not ended. It had simply learned to hide its pulse behind sweetness. The irony was almost poetic. The heirs of Mariani's formula had removed the coca, renamed it refreshment, and built fortunes upon its diluted ghost. In Europe, the Great War arrived and swept away the last remnants of the old world. Soldiers carried morphine, not tonics. Fatigue was no longer shameful, it was patriotic. Death replaced exhaustion as the measure of endurance. When the war ended, few remembered the era that had worshipped a bottle. The 20th century had found new ways to stay awake. In a museum in Paris, one of the last intact bottles stood on a velvet cushion. Visitors passed by without lingering. The guide described it as a relic of industrial optimism, his tone both admiring and amused. Children laughed softly at the idea that people once drank cocaine in wine. To them, it was a curiosity, not a tragedy. But occasionally, an older visitor, a doctor perhaps, or an artist's widow would pause before the glass and look longer. For them, the bottle did not represent folly, but something subtler, the brief, shining moment when humanity believed that progress could be kind, that science could be gentle, that vitality could come without consequence. They would move on after a while, leaving the bottle behind still, silent, and faintly red beneath the museum light. The drink had died, but its echo lingered in the bloodstream of modern life, a quiet reminder that every cure, in time, becomes its own disease. By the time the guns of the Great War had fallen silent, the world that had once worshipped the red glow of Vin Mariani existed only in fragments, photographs, clippings, and brittle paper labels that curled with age in forgotten drawers. Yet somehow, the brand refused to die. It lingered like a scent too deeply soaked into wood to wash away. Wherever there were bottles, there were echoes. Wherever there was fatigue, there was memory. In the decades after the war, collectors began to appear, antique dealers, apothecaries, and nostalgic doctors who hoarded the remnants of the 19th century's optimism. They called them les reliques du progrès, the relics of progress. One could find the ghost of Mariani's name on faded parchment labels in the markets of Montmartre or the attics of rural estates. The lettering, still gilt in places, read, Vin tonic, Mariani, au coca du Peru. To the untrained eye, it was merely decoration. To those who remembered, it was an invocation. Museums began to take interest. In 1924, the Musée d'Histoire de la Médecine in Paris acquired 2 sealed bottles from a retired physician's collection. They placed them in a glass cabinet between early anesthetics and quack tonics. A small plaque beneath them read, Exemple d'un stimulant populaire du XVIe siècle. Visitors passed by, curious but detached. Few lingered long enough to see their own reflection shimmering faintly in the dusty glass eyes, momentarily aligned with the ghost of a label that once promised them immortality. In America, where advertising had become the new religion, Mariani's aesthetic lived on. The swirling fonts, the bright laurels, the elegant testimonials, all were reincarnated in posters for colas, cigarettes, and nerve tonics. Copywriters, ignorant of the French chemist's name, borrowed his vocabulary without realizing it. Invigorating, restorative, for the modern age. Even the smiling faces of celebrities holding beverages in newspapers owed their lineage to the portraits that once adorned Mariani's office walls. Meanwhile, in Europe, the last bottles began to resurface in stranger places, auction houses, libraries, even hospitals clearing out storage rooms. Each discovery made the newspapers for a day, described in tones of fascination and mild horror. A bottle of Vin Mariani found intact, they would write, contents discolored, cork decayed, scent still faintly sweet. For a moment, the world would remember the century that had believed in elixirs before moving on to newer obsessions. Radio waves, psychoanalysis, speed. One such bottle found its way into the possession of a Parisian artist named Colette Renan, who placed it on her desk as a kind of talisman. She was not religious, nor sentimental. She simply found beauty in decay. Sometimes, during the long nights when she painted until dawn, she would lift the bottle and watch the lamplight shimmer through its dark contents. "It looks like blood," she once told a friend. But perhaps all art does, if you look closely enough. By mid-century, the brand had become myth, its name slipping into the vocabulary of collectors and chemists like a ghost through a half-open door. Vin Mariani was no longer a drink, it was an idea, that humanity could distill joy, trap it in glass, and sip eternity one mouthful at a time. And yet, even as the century hardened into modernity, people still bought tonics, still sought quickness, still paid for clarity. The labels changed, the formulas evolved, but the longing remained the same. In an antique shop on the Rue de Lille, a faded poster still hangs today, the colors nearly gone. A woman in white raises a glass to her lips beneath the golden words, "La force dans une bouteille." The edges are torn, the paper yellowed, the promise eternal. For those who stop to look, the label seems almost to breathe, a ghost whispering from another century, asking softly, "Do you still believe?" Dr. Armand Roux, a Parisian physician of some reputation, began prescribing it in the winter of 1878. His patients adored him for it. They came to him grey and hollow-eyed from factory work, sleepless nights, or fashionable melancholy. They left glowing, talkative, and grateful. He took notes after every visit. Improvement of appetite, greater cheer, strength of mind returned. Within weeks, the waiting room overflowed. Women in black veils whispered that Dr. Roux had found a remedy for grief itself. He too began to drink it, a glass in the morning to understand his patients better, another at dusk, to focus on his records. Soon, the bottle moved from his cabinet to his desk, the cork loosened, always within reach. The line between doctor and patient, between healer and believer, blurred. Across Europe, the pattern repeated itself. In Vienna, a surgeon prescribed it for post-operative recovery. In Berlin, a military physician recommended it for soldiers returning from colonial campaigns. In London, fashionable women requested it as a cure for nerves and delicate digestion. The advertisements called it the modern miracle rest without sleep. Pharmacists loved it too. It was expensive, yes, but respectable, the kind of medicine that made a shop look distinguished. They displayed the bottles in their front windows like jewels. The crimson glass caught the gaslight and glowed faintly even after closing time, as if the city itself could not sleep without it. But beneath the glow came murmurs. A few doctors began to notice the restlessness in their patients, the sleeplessness, the trembling, the strange, empty hunger that followed the euphoria. Some whispered that the wine takes more than it gives. Others defended it fiercely. Progress always comes with discomfort. No one wanted to return to an age of weakness. Dr. Roux's notes grew less tidy as the months went on. The word improved appeared less often, required another bottle more so. He no longer slept through the night. Sometimes he would wake with his pulse racing and his thoughts too bright to rest. Still, at dawn, he poured himself another glass. He told himself it was only medicine, a tonic. Nothing dangerous could look so elegant, taste so divine, or bear the signature of the Pope himself. In his cabinet, the bottles gleamed in neat, endless rows, their reflections overlapping in the morning light, a cathedral of glass built for the worship of energy. And as the city beyond his windows stirred awake, so too did the doctor, his hands trembling, his mind alight, a priest of a faith he could no longer control. In a quiet room of the Musée d'Histoire de la Médecine, sunlight filtered through dusty glass and struck the wall of portraits. They were arranged in a long, deliberate line, men and women of stature, now sepia and fading, who had once written letters of gratitude to Angelo Mariani. The famous and the forgotten posed in their prime, the actress with her jeweled collar, the bishop in his cassock, the physician in his white coat, the explorer in his travel uniform still dusted with glory. Beneath each frame, a brass plate bore their name and the year their letter was written. Few visitors realized that most of those years had also marked the beginning of their decline. A small card beside the display explained it simply. patrons of Vin Mariani, 1865–1895. To the modern viewer, the faces looked ordinary enough. To those who knew the history, they were the saints of an invisible religion, believers in the bottle's grace. Each had sought something different from Mariani's creation: courage, focus, relief, salvation. But in every portrait there was the same unmistakable gleam in the eyes, that unnatural brightness of a soul perpetually alight. Doctors, analyzing these photographs decades later, would comment on the clues hidden in plain sight: the hollow cheeks of the soprano who had sung herself into an early grave, the tense smile of the politician who collapsed mid-speech, the painter whose pupils seemed too large for daylight. None had considered themselves addicts. They were professionals, artists, thinkers, the modern elite, and in their time, the word had not yet been invented for them. They were simply devotees of vitality. Historians began to piece together their stories from diaries, medical records, and letters. Sarah Bernhardt's fervent praise of Mariani's tonic was well known, but few remembered her later confessions of trembling hands and sleepless nights. Jules Verne, who had written of adventure and progress, mentioned the red tonic that awakens invention in a notebook from his declining years. Even the clergy were not exempt. Father Henri de la Tour, whose sermons once praised the divine energy of the coca leaf, died at 53, his heart found enlarged. The museum's curator, a man named Gérard Lemoine, often lingered before these portraits at closing time. "They are not villains," he would say softly to his interns. "They were the first citizens of our modern disease, the belief that fatigue is failure." He polished the glass with a gentle cloth, as if afraid to disturb the stillness of their gaze. They remind us that addiction rarely begins in darkness. It begins in light, in hope. In another wing of the museum, a smaller exhibition displayed the artifacts of dependency: empty bottles, medical pamphlets, advertisements promising restorative purity. Visitors passed from the wall of portraits to these objects in silence, the connection dawning slowly. It was not a story of vice, but of longing, a record of what happens when progress promises more life than a body can bear. Occasionally, an older visitor would stop, press a hand to the glass, and whisper a name, perhaps of a relative, perhaps of a memory. Then they would move on, leaving a faint reflection among the faces of the once immortal. Outside, the streets of Paris buzzed with new lights, new distractions, but within that quiet hall, the portraits watched in eternal stillness, the loyal congregation of a vanished faith, framed forever at the moment when the wine still glowed and the world still believed that exhaustion could be cured by grace. And in their eyes, caught in the flicker of museum light, the old gleam endured a faint, trembling reminder that progress, for all its miracles, has never learned to sleep. In the shop fronts of Paris, apothecaries learned how to smile like merchants. The old smell of camphor and chalk now mingled with the sweet perfume of Vin Mariani, drawing in customers not with necessity, but with promise. The age of dust and leeches had passed. This was the century of bottled vitality. Behind polished counters, rows of crimson glass gleamed like rubies, their labels curling in gold. The apothecary's hands, once accustomed to grinding herbs and mixing pastes, now turned deftly to the art of arrangement. Each bottle was angled toward the light, catching the reflections of gas lamps and passing carriages. In one such shop near the Rue Saint-Honoré, Monsieur Lefebvre had become something of a local celebrity. His shelves carried every modern miracle from ether to chloroform, from digestive bitters to Mariani's coca wine. Customers adored his soft voice and the faint smile that never left his lips. "It is the medicine of the future," he would tell them, tapping a finger against the bottle's neck. "No opium, no intoxication, only vigor. It puts light back into the eyes." He poured samples into small crystal cups for ladies in lace gloves and gentlemen with weary faces. The first sip always brought that quiet widening of the eyes, the soft flush in the cheeks. He had seen it 100 times, and yet it never ceased to satisfy him the moment when weariness dissolved into wonder. He'd smile again, refilling the cup, as the customer murmured, "Remarkable. How clean it feels." By afternoon, his shop filled with murmuring bodies. Clerks, widows, school teachers, travelers, all drawn by the same promise of renewed strength. Some came weekly, others daily. He knew their stories without needing to ask. The widow who had stopped crying but could not sleep. The young man whose studies left him trembling. The actor whose confidence came only in liquid form. To each he gave the same prescription. One glass in the morning and one in the evening, and you will feel life return. At closing time, Lefebvre counted his earnings, then poured himself a measure from an opened bottle. The warmth spread through him like familiarity. He stood by the window, watching the carriages roll by, the city shimmering beneath its electric lights. Vin Mariani had changed his trade entirely. No longer did he mix powders in silence or measure out pain by the ounce. He sold energy, now bottled optimism. Still, some nights, when he returned home and the street lamps flickered through the curtains, he thought of the people who never came back. There were always a few smiling, flushed, full of thanks, who vanished without explanation. Perhaps they had found another supplier, he told himself, or perhaps they no longer needed him. The thought soothed him enough to sleep. But outside, the city's windows glowed long into the night. The same red reflections shimmered from Montmartre to Montparnasse, thousands of bottles, glinting behind glass. Each one, a small sun burning quietly in its cage. Monsieur Lefebvre would wake at dawn and unlock the door again. The bell above it chimed softly, and the first customer would already be waiting, pale and polite, asking for another bottle of the Paris miracle. He smiled, as always, and handed it over, unaware that the light in their eyes was borrowed, and that he himself had long been one of its most loyal patients. And so the apothecary's smile endured the gentle mask of a man who no longer sold medicine, but belief. In the spring of 1914, long after his factories had fallen silent and his name had faded from the lips of society, Angelo Mariani was buried in a small cemetery in Corsica, beneath a sky that smelled of salt and myrtle. No procession, no speeches, only the local priest, 2 cousins, and the faint hum of the sea. The man who had once bottled the breath of modernity left the world as quietly as he had entered it, a chemist, a dreamer, and the architect of his own forgotten empire. His gravestone bore only his name, the dates, and 3 words carved into the stone by a mason who had never met him: l'énergie, la foi. Energy, faith, the twin deities that had guided his life. Perhaps it was a tribute, or perhaps a gentle irony, though no one could say which. Back in Paris, the office on Boulevard Haussmann still stood, its windows shuttered, its rooms filled with dust. The ledgers remained on their shelves, brittle and yellowing, each line a ghost of commerce. Queen Victoria, 12 bottles. Pope Leo XIII, 24. Edison Laboratories, 6 cases. The handwriting trembled slightly near the end, as if the man had known the ink was outlasting him. A few curious historians came after the war, rummaging through what was left of his archives. They found letters from admirers long dead, invoices stamped with royal crests, and advertisements bearing the same line repeated like prayer. La force dans une bouteille, the force in a bottle. It sounded absurd now, even naive, in a world that had just watched entire nations collapse under their own inventions. Yet in those fragile papers lay the blueprint of modern life, the belief that energy could be manufactured, sold, and consumed without consequence. One researcher, a young woman named Elise Fontaine, later wrote a small book about him titled The Dream of the Chemist. In her preface, she described visiting the ruins of his factory. "The vats are empty," she wrote, "but they still smell, faintly, of wine and leaves." I stood in the silence and realized that we had not abandoned Mariani's dream. We have simply replaced the bottle with the world itself. By the 1930s, Mariani's grave had become a curiosity for passing tourists, chemists, collectors, the occasional eccentric journalist. They came expecting scandal, perhaps a cautionary tale, but found only a modest stone half swallowed by weeds. Someone, perhaps a former worker, left a small glass bottle without a label on the grave each spring. No one knew who. The locals called it le pèlerinage de la fatigue, the pilgrimage of exhaustion. It was said that, on warm afternoons, the sea wind would catch the old cork and make a faint sound, a sigh, a whisper, a breath. Perhaps it was only imagination, yet those who heard it swore it sounded almost human, as though the chemist himself were still exhaling the last trace of his miracle into the modern air. In that sound lived his epitaph, not the carved stone or the fading advertisements, but the quiet truth of his legacy, that every age, no matter how enlightened, will always seek its potion against fatigue, that progress itself is merely the human desire to stay awake a little longer. And so, under a Corsican sky, the man who had once taught the world how to drink its own energy at last gave it back one final breath to feed the empire of motion he had left behind. It began, as revolutions so often do, with ink. By the early 1890s, Europe's faith in Vin Mariani had begun to fracture. The same newspapers that had once toasted its virtues now smelled scandal in its sweetness. It was not a sudden shift, but a gathering of unease, small editorials at first, then full-page arguments, until the great press engines of Paris and London thundered like cannons. The first volley came from Le Matin, whose headline declared, "The wine that works too well." The article described fashionable ladies fainting from excess vitality, students collapsing from sleeplessness, priests trembling during Mass. The tone was not moral outrage but fascination, the thrill of witnessing a miracle turn monstrous. Within weeks, other papers followed: Le Figaro, the Pall Mall Gazette, the New York Sunday. Each carried its own mixture of gossip and indignation. What had once been Paris's proudest export now carried the scent of danger in Dejacia, Mariani's factory on Boulevard Haussmann. The clerks clipped and stacked each article for their employer. By noon, the desk was buried in paper headlines crying, "Is coca wine a curse? The Pope's poison? The Queen's secret habit?" Some were absurd, some cruel, but all had power. In an age that believed whatever the press proclaimed, ink could sour even the sweetest taste. Angelo Mariani read the first few with irritation, then silence. He had weathered criticism before, but this was different. The accusations no longer questioned his product's strength, they questioned his morality. They called him an alchemist of appetite, a merchant of fatigue. They said he had bottled Europe's decline and sold it back to her as vitality. He wrote letters of rebuttal to every editor who would print them. He sent testimonials from physicians, explorers, even priests, swearing by the tonic's safety. He paid for full-page advertisements filled with the faces of his patrons Bernhardt, Verne, Edison, Victoria, Leo XIII, arranged like saints in a modern cathedral. The headline read, "Endorsed by genius, blessed by God." But even faith has limits. The public no longer wanted saints, it wanted scandal. Across Paris, pharmacies began to remove his posters. Some replaced them with imitations boasting free from coca. In London, a temperance society printed pamphlets titled "The Red Devil of Paris." In New York, an American chemist unveiled his own non-intoxicating substitute, a syrup that promised refreshment without sin. He called it Coca-Cola. Mariani tried to ignore the encroaching storm. He increased production, lowered prices, wrote polite letters to the ministries. But the rumor mill turned faster than any press he could pay. Even the doctors who had built their reputations on his tonic now spoke cautiously in public, as though ashamed of their own excitement. One morning, he found a caricature of himself in a satirical weekly, his head drawn as a wine bottle, his hands pouring red liquid into the open mouths of Europe. The caption read, "The chemist of the century, or its undertaker." He tore the page in two, but its echo lingered. Outside, the printing presses clattered on, turning faith to fear, miracle to menace. The same ink that had made Angelo Mariani immortal was now erasing him line by line, and in the cafes where the gossip was thickest, people still lifted their glasses not to praise, but to whisper, "Do you think it's true?" They drank anyway, but the taste had changed. Each sip now carried a trace of guilt, as if the wine itself were reading the morning papers and blushing. Morning in Paris began with ritual. The sound of carriage wheels, the rustle of newspapers, the clatter of shutters swinging open to the pale gold light. But for many, the day did not truly begin until the bottle was uncorked, that faint pop, followed by the deep perfume of Bordeaux and coca. In parlors, offices, and rectories alike, Vin Mariani had become more than habit. It was faith in liquid form. The chemist's invention had traveled far beyond the language of science. It was now a sacrament of the modern world, a small act of devotion to the new god of vitality. Doctors prescribed it, but priests blessed it. Mothers poured it before prayers, explorers before setting sail. A glass before labor, the advertisements read, and the world becomes light again. The words were printed in gold, framed by laurels and the faces of those who had risen, writers, inventors, even the Pope himself. In the shop windows, bottles stood like candles before an altar. They glowed red under the gaslight, each one promising to banish fatigue, despair, and age. It was no longer sold with the language of medicine, but with the language of hope. "It restores the will to live," said one pamphlet. "It conquers the weight of the spirit." And people believed. In the Rue de Rivoli, a young widow named Geneviève began each day with a ritual of her own. She drew the curtains, lit a small lamp, and poured a single measure of Mariani's wine into her crystal glass. The ruby glow filled the room. She lifted it to her lips and whispered softly, as though saying grace. The warmth rose through her body, and for a moment, just a moment, she felt alive again, her grief blurring at the edges. The bottle on her table was half empty now, though she could not remember when she had opened it. In a Paris hospital ward, a priest carried the same bottle in his satchel as he moved among the beds. The sick adored him for it. He poured tiny portions into their cups, murmuring blessings over each one. "It is God's strength in man's form," he told them. He was not lying, only mistaken. The patients smiled, cheeks flushed, hearts racing, whispering prayers that felt newly heard. Even Angelo Mariani, in his private moments, had begun to think of his creation not as a tonic, but as something divine. In his letters to investors, he wrote that fatigue is the original sin of civilization, and Vin Mariani, its redemption. When he entered his factory each morning, he walked the rows of barrels like pews, the air thick with the scent of fermenting wine and crushed leaves. Workers bowed their heads slightly as he passed, and he nodded in return, accepting the reverence as if he were both chemist and cleric. Yet beneath the reverence, an unease began to spread. Doctors whispered that some patients no longer responded to lower doses. Others could not sleep without their evening glass. In the newspapers, one letter dared to ask, "Can vitality be too constant? Can faith itself consume the faithful?" The editor cut the line before printing. Still, the bottles multiplied, filling cabinets, parlors, and altars alike. People no longer spoke of drinking it. They spoke of taking it, like communion. The difference between science and worship had evaporated completely, and so, when the city's bells tolled each Sunday, thousands lifted their glasses at the same hour, eyes closed, hearts quickened, believers in a creed that asked for nothing but devotion, one sip at a time. Spring settled over Paris like a fever dream. The chestnut trees along the boulevards unfurled their white blossoms, and the river gleamed with ribbons of reflected light. The city had never looked more alive, nor moved more quickly. Everywhere, invention bloomed beside decay, telephones crackled, carriages rattled, typewriters clicked, and behind the velvet curtains of cafes, people drank to keep pace with the century itself. Among the chatter and perfume, Vin Mariani had become the scent of progress. Its posters bloomed across the walls of the city like flowers of glass and gold. Women in silk lifting glasses toward the sky, explorers raising bottles against the desert sun, priests blessing the crimson glow. Even the kiosks smelled faintly of it, a mix of ink, glue, and the ghost of Bordeaux. Beneath every streetlight, one could see the reflection of a bottle somewhere in a shop window, on a cafe shelf, in a doctor's waiting room. Inside the cafes of Montmartre, the artists drank it like communion, the young ones, dreamers, anarchists, painters still smelling of turpentine called it the blood of the new century. They claimed it cleared the fog between thought and creation, that its sweetness sharpened their genius. One sip before the brush, another before the pen. Between the coffee and the absinthe, Vin Mariani stood as the respectable middle ground, the indulgence that pretended to be virtue. At the Café de la Nouvelle Athènes, a poet named Mallarmé raised his glass and declared that the tonic reminds man that his soul can burn brighter than his body. His friends laughed, clinking glasses that trembled under the lamplight. "Then let us burn," said a painter beside him, his eyes already bright with that unmistakable shine, the feverish calm of someone both exalted and undone. In the salons of the bourgeoisie, the ritual was more discreet. Bottles stood behind silver trays, offered as an after-dinner cordial. Gentlemen praised its refinement. Ladies swore by its grace. "It steadies the heart," they said, "and quickens the wit." They did not know, or refused to know, that the quickness they admired was a symptom. Hands trembled slightly when pouring, conversations raced ahead of thought, laughter bloomed too easily and vanished just as fast. The coca leaf had wound its way into Parisian society not as a vice, but as a virtue polished to a mirror shine. At night, when the theatres emptied and the cafes spilled laughter into the streets, the city glowed red, not just from lanterns and wine, but from the pulse of something unseen, humming through its veins. The Seine itself seemed to shimmer with the same restless energy. Angelo Mariani walked those streets sometimes, hands clasped behind his back, watching as his creation touched every corner of life. He passed actors emerging from stage doors, students reciting poetry under gas lamps, women leaning from balconies with cold, half-finished glasses in hand. All of them moved with a strange, graceful urgency, alive beyond exhaustion. He could feel pride rising in him like the warmth of the very drink he had made. Paris in bloom, he thought the world renewed by chemistry. Yet somewhere beneath that beauty was something he could not name. A tremor, a shadow, a note too sharp in the city's bright song. Still, the streets glittered, and the bottles shone in every window. To doubt such radiance seemed impossible. After all, what could be more innocent than a glass raised in the name of progress when all the world was drunk on the promise of its own brilliance? The British Empire, in its gilded prime, was a creature of exhaustion disguised as triumph. It spanned continents, commanded oceans, and consumed its own strength as greedily as it consumed the world. In the late 1880s, its officials and soldiers carried not only the Union Jack into distant lands, but also bottles of Vin Mariani, that crimson symbol of endurance which promised to keep the empire awake. In the ports of Calcutta, crates of coca wine arrived alongside rifles, sewing machines, and soap. The labels, printed in French but easily understood by all, bore their familiar gold laurels and testimonials. Each shipment was destined for the outposts of empire, colonial hospitals, officers' clubs, and missionary houses. To the men who governed half the earth from their tents and verandas, fatigue was treason. The Queen's cordial became their unspoken sacrament. At dawn, in the Indian hill stations, officers in khaki uniforms drank it before the parade ground. "It steadies the heat," one captain wrote in his journal, "and lifts the fog from the mind." In the tropical humidity of Ceylon and Malaya, missionaries sipped it before their sermons, calling it a mercy in this accursed climate. Soldiers swallowed it with quinine to ward off fever, while engineers drank it through the long nights spent surveying the railroads that carved through jungles and deserts. The empire's arteries ran on steam, sweat, and coca. Even the advertisements changed tone to suit their dominions. In India, pamphlets declared it the civilized wine of progress, favored by Her Majesty. In Egypt, travelers found it praised as the Christian tonic against Eastern fatigue. Mariani's agents knew how to sell to power. They spoke the language of endurance, not indulgence. In London's Colonial Office, the clerks who processed reports from across the empire began to notice a pattern. Letters from far-flung administrators carried the same praise. Your tonic is indispensable. I write these reports only with its assistance. Without it, the mind falters in the sun. The tone of these dispatches bordered on reverence, their words as uniform as the red seal on each bottle. By 1889, coca wine had become part of imperial logistics. Shipments were listed in the same ledgers as ammunition and medical supplies. The empire, like its monarch, had found its nerve tonic, and with every sip, the boundary between vitality and dependency dissolved further. Yet in the corners of this vast machinery, small cracks appeared. In the barracks of Bombay, a sergeant collapsed after weeks without sleep, his pulse erratic, his pupils wide. In a hospital in Cairo, a missionary's trembling hand spilled the chalice during Mass. In Nairobi, railway workers whispered that the white men had a red drink that made them mad. The empire brushed these incidents aside as exaggerations, necessary costs of progress. In Paris, Angelo Mariani received orders from British agents requesting double shipments. He knew better than to ask questions. His wine had become the bloodstream of civilization itself. Its vigor and its decay poured from the same bottle. And so, while Queen Victoria slept beneath the watchful eye of her apothecary, her governors and soldiers stayed awake across the world, drinking from their glasses beneath foreign stars. They called it strength, they called it endurance. But what it truly was, what no one dared name, was addiction, stamped with the royal crest and carried to every corner of the globe. The empire never saw it that way, of course. From Westminster to Rangoon, the story remained the same. The empire did not tire, the empire did not falter, and if it did, there was always more wine. The century was running on fumes disguised as faith. Beneath the roar of factories and orchestras, there was a quieter sound, the steady clink of a spoon against glass, the exhale, after a sip, the whispered promise, just one more. By the early 1890s, the miracle of Vin Mariani had ripened into dependency. The same men and women who had once praised it as salvation now drank it as survival. In Paris, where the boulevards glittered and the nights stretched endless, addiction had become invisible, hidden beneath manners, lace, and etiquette. It was no longer the vice of the poor or the desperate. It was the exhaustion of the refined, the banker who could not rise without it, the actress who trembled before each performance, the priest who poured a measure before every sermon. Each called it something else: necessity, ritual, faith, but their prayers were the same. At the Théâtre du Châtelet, Sarah Bernhardt stood before her mirror, her dressing room filled with perfume and smoke. A half-empty bottle rested beside her rouge pot. She dabbed the wine on her lips like a benediction, whispering, "For courage." The warmth spread through her chest, her pulse steadied, her reflection softened. Moments later, she was radiant beneath the stage, lights her exhaustion disguised as brilliance, her dependence mistaken for inspiration. In a cramped apartment on Rue du Temple, a young writer named Auguste lay awake at dawn, his fingers stained with ink and wine. He had written for 30 hours without rest, his thoughts darting like birds in a storm. When the rush faded, he drank again, desperate to chase the clarity that slipped further away each time. His prayers were written in the margins of his manuscript. Let it come back, let it come back. Even the doctors had begun to rely on what they prescribed. One London physician confessed in his diary that he could not treat patients without a glass to steady his reasoning. Another, in Vienna, called it "my quiet assistant." They spoke of tolerance and dosage as if describing theology, not chemistry. Each believed they were in control, even as the bottle dictated the terms. In churches, sermons warned of moral decay, of gambling, of lust, of drink. but never of the coca wine that glowed innocently on parishioners' tables. It was too elegant to condemn, too respectable to fear. Addiction had learned the language of virtue. Angelo Mariani received hundreds of letters each month, but they had changed. Fewer spoke of gratitude, more spoke of need. "It no longer restores me as it did," wrote a duchess. "My heart races, my sleep eludes me," confessed a clergyman. Yet every one of them ended the same way: "Please send more." Mariani read these confessions with a mixture of pride and discomfort. He told himself that the fault lay not in the wine, but in excess, that people had forgotten moderation in their hunger for modernity. Still, the letters haunted him. He kept them in a drawer he rarely opened, though he knew by heart the desperate phrases that filled it. Outside, Paris glittered on, oblivious. The cafes overflowed, the theatres thrummed, and every glass raised to progress was also a small act of surrender. And in the quiet hours before dawn, when the rush wore off and the heart began to flutter, the city prayed not to God, not to reason, but to the crimson bottle beside the bed. It was the new religion of fatigue, a faith that promised deliverance one sip at a time and demanded, in the end, everything. The first murmurs of unease rose not from the poor, who had long since learned to bear the burdens of indulgence, but from the learned and the righteous doctors, clergymen, moral reformers, who saw in Vin Mariani the same shimmering deceit that had once surrounded gin and laudanum. By the early 1890s, the age of certainty was beginning to fray. The faith in progress, so long unchallenged, had grown anxious. If electricity and chemistry could make life brighter, could they not also scorch it? In London, a series of letters appeared in The Lancet, signed only "A Physician of Conscience." The writer described patients of refinement, whose eyes gleam unnaturally, whose sleep is shallow, whose strength depends upon the cork of a bottle. He wrote of tremors mistaken for liveliness, of laughter that bordered on hysteria. "We are manufacturing exhaustion," he warned, "and bottling its cure." The editors published the letters cautiously, afraid to seem reactionary. Still, they spread. Across the Channel, similar voices began to whisper. In Paris, Dr. Émile Dubois, a physician once friendly with Mariani himself, stood before the Academy of Medicine and declared, "We have mistaken the illusion of vitality for the fact of health. The leaf that feeds our ambition also consumes it." The chamber fell silent. Some nodded gravely, others dismissed him as melodramatic. But when his words reached the newspapers, the public stirred. The Church, too, began to take notice. The Vatican's earlier blessing of Vin Mariani had lent it divine credibility, but new generations of clergy were less forgiving. "To alter the spirit is to trespass upon the soul," wrote a young Jesuit in La Croix. "The body may serve God, but the heart must beat of its own accord." He did not name the wine, but everyone knew. Even within polite society, the tone shifted. Hostesses began to whisper that too much of the tonic spoiled the complexion. Doctors advised patients to rest the nerves with abstinence, though many of those same physicians kept a private supply. The word dependency entered conversation for the first time, a delicate euphemism for something impolite to name. Angelo Mariani read these criticisms with calm disdain. He issued statements insisting his wine was harmless when used as directed. He reminded the public of the Queen's patronage, the Pope's blessing, the hundreds of physicians who still endorsed it. "My tonic does not create weakness," he wrote in Le Figaro. "It corrects it." The paper printed his words beneath an engraving of his smiling face, a reassurance to readers who preferred denial over doubt. Yet behind his composure, Mariani felt the shift. Orders still arrived, but letters from physicians grew cautious, their praise less effusive. The moralists, for all their prudery, had struck a chord. A new century loomed on the horizon, one less enchanted with miracles and more wary of their costs. In parlours once fragrant with the wine's sweetness, glasses were raised less often. Some replaced it with tea, others with silence. The city's hum dulled ever so slightly, as if Paris herself had paused for breath. But beneath that stillness, the craving remained. For every critic who preached moderation, there were 100 quiet believers who could not give it up, not yet. They read the warnings, nodded, and poured another glass. And somewhere between their guilt and their pleasure, the modern conscience was born fragile, trembling, and already addicted to its own enlightenment. The laboratories of Europe in the late 19th century hummed like hives. Glass clinked, burners hissed, and the air was thick with the scent of alcohol, ether, and ambition. Chemistry had become the new religion of the age, and men in white coats its priests. They spoke of progress, of the conquest of fatigue and fear, of the power to unlock the body's hidden energies. In this new creed, Vin Mariani was no heresy. It was proof that science could make paradise tangible. At the Sorbonne, medical students debated the tonic in hushed fascination. It excites the nervous system, one said, but without the vulgar agitation of spirits. It stimulates respiration, added another, and sharpens the faculties. The journals agreed. La Gazette Médicale de Paris praised it as a harmonious stimulant, invigorating yet tranquil. To doctors who had watched morphine turn into madness and absinthe into delirium, coca wine seemed a miracle of restraint. All the work, clarity, none of the collapse. The experiments multiplied. In London, at Guy's Hospital, physicians measured pulse rates after a single glass, finding them elevated but steady. In Vienna, a young neurologist named Sigmund Freud took note of these results with particular interest. He wrote that coca banishes hunger, sleep, and fatigue, calling it a divine plant. Mariani read Freud's words and smiled. His wine had become a bridge between the spiritual and the scientific, the miracle endorsed by both church and laboratory. Posters began to appear not only in cafes and theaters, but in medical offices, prescribed by leading physicians for exhaustion, melancholia, and nervous disorders. Even the apothecaries who stocked it beside morphine and laudanum bottles spoke of it with reverence. It restores, they told patients. It purifies. And why should they doubt it? The evidence seemed plain: flushed cheeks, quicker smiles, steady hands. Mariani himself leaned into the aura of precision. He began, including pamphlets with each shipment, citing studies and testimonies. They contained graphs of pulse strength and respiration, letters from doctors describing miraculous recoveries. A woman of 50 who could not rise from bed now walks the boulevards daily. Read one account. A student overcome with fatigue now works 12 hours without pause. No one questioned that these results came from stimulation, not healing. The century wanted miracles, not moderation. In private, though, a few physicians grew uneasy. Dr. Jean-Baptiste Dujardin, a physiologist in Lyon, noticed that his patients required larger and larger doses. Their sleep grew restless, their moods brittle. He presented a paper warning that coca produces an unnatural gaiety, followed by a deep fatigue. His colleagues dismissed it as jealousy. The world had no appetite for moderation when progress tasted so sweet. Back in Paris, Mariani's laboratory glowed each night like a lighthouse. Workers moved among the vats of Bordeaux, stirring in measured quantities of extract, the scent of alcohol, and coca thick in the air. Mariani often stayed late, adjusting formulas, reading new medical reports. He felt a quiet pride knowing that he was part of something greater, the transformation of medicine into art. To him, Vin Mariani was not indulgence. It was enlightenment in liquid form. Yet even he began to notice the pattern, the letters that praised his wine in one season and ceased to arrive the next. An actress, a doctor, a composer. Silence. Their absence was explained away easily. Illness, travel, new work. Still, sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he caught himself staring at the glass in his hand, wondering whether science had indeed created a cure for fatigue or merely found a prettier name for dependency. Then morning came, and the world's faith in chemistry blazed on. And so he poured another measure, raised it to the light, and drank to progress, to genius, to the bright, trembling promise of euphoria. The new century opened its eyes beneath the hum of machinery and the soft hiss of carbonation. The world no longer drank to feel divine, it drank to stay awake. Wine had given way to syrup, and science, once alchemy's proud heir, now bent itself to marketing. Humanity had not renounced the stimulant, it had only changed its flavor, and so began what chemists quietly called l'âge du substitut, the age of substitution. In laboratories from Paris to Philadelphia, the same men who had once distilled laudanum and coca began extracting caffeine from tea leaves and guarana. The word pure replaced miracle in advertisements. Purity was the new opiate, cleanliness the new intoxication. Free from alcohol, free from narcotic, scientifically tested, these were the new spells of faith. The bottle still gleamed, the liquid still promised transformation, but the claim had changed. Now it was safety itself that thrilled. Pharmaceutical firms multiplied overnight, each racing to invent a substitute for something once forbidden. They sold imitation morphine that soothed without stupor, synthetic adrenaline that awakened without frenzy, patent pills that calmed without confession. Each claimed to mend the damage of its predecessor, but the pattern was the same: desire suppressed, then reborn in new disguise. The stimulant had gone underground, not into the veins, but into the bloodstream of commerce. Coca leaves, once smuggled through Marseille and Genoa for Mariani's tonic, were now harvested by industrial corporations for scientific use. Laboratories in New Jersey and London purchased them by the ton, stripping the narcotic from the leaf, leaving only its harmless flavor. The residue was used for the booming beverage trade. Consumers believed they had escaped vice. The chemists knew better. The world was now addicted not to cocaine, but to control, to the illusion of mastery over its cravings. In cafes that had once served Vin Mariani, waiters now carried trays of gleaming bottles filled with amber soda. The hiss of carbonation replaced the soft pour of wine. The ritual was nearly the same: the anticipation, the spark of pleasure, the faint lift behind the eyes. Only the guilt was gone. It's harmless, people said, smiling. It's progress. The irony deepened each year. Where Mariani's chemists had worn white coats and humility, the new century's inventors wore corporate suits and carried slogans. They no longer promised salvation. They promised satisfaction. They no longer courted queens or popes, but courted shareholders. The alchemy of the 19th century had become the economics of the 20th. In Paris, the last of Mariani's apprentices, an old chemist named Dufresne, stood outside one of these soda cafes and watched the glittering bottles lined beneath the mirrored counter. The laughter inside reminded him of the nights when Vin Mariani was poured in theaters and parlors, when people drank not to forget but to feel alive. He whispered, "It's the same wine, only colder." No one heard him. By the eve of the Great War, stimulants no longer needed secrecy or sanctity. They had become democracy in liquid form, sold to all, trusted by all, questioned by none. The world had mastered moderation by industrializing excess, and so the age of substitution began its long reign, gilded by caffeine and conscience, its promise identical to the one Mariani once whispered into his glass: "You will not grow tired again." The words remained true, only the taste had changed. The paper storm had barely begun to settle when the imitators returned in force. Like vultures circling a wounded lion, rival chemists, merchants, and swindlers smelled opportunity in Mariani's troubles. If the public's faith in Vin Mariani had been shaken, its craving had not. People might doubt the name, but not the need. By the mid-1890s, Europe was awash in crimson bottles bearing familiar shapes and familiar promises. Their labels mimicked the golden script and laurels of the original, but their contents were concocted in cellars, not laboratories. In the backstreets of Lyon, in the alleys of Brussels, in the East End of London, counterfeiters worked by candlelight, stirring cheap claret and coca leaf residue into a syrup thick with sugar and deceit. Some added morphine for strength, others replaced wine altogether with alcohols so harsh they burned the throat. The public didn't care. They wanted what the advertisements had taught them to want: energy, color, relief. Authenticity mattered less than effect. In Paris, small pharmacies began stocking what they called affordable alternatives. Coca Bordeaux, the people's Vin, Royal Tonic of Peru, each bottle a cheaper echo of Mariani's empire. Clerks whispered to customers that it was the same formula or from the same chemist. Few could tell the difference until it was too late. A housemaid was found dead in Montmartre after drinking half a bottle of Coca Rouge. The newspapers made brief mention of her passing, but spent twice as many words on her poverty as on her poisoning. The chaos spread beyond France. In Italy, a Turin factory produced Mariana Vino, its label nearly identical save for a misplaced letter. In Spain, El Vino de la Reina Victoria flooded the market, complete with forged royal crests. Even in South America, exporters began bottling local wine with crushed coca and sending it back across the Atlantic, a cruel inversion of the trade that had begun the craze. Mariani fought back the only way he could, with the law and with pride. He hired investigators, sued for trademark violations, and printed warnings in newspapers, urging customers to accept no imitations. But the courts moved slowly, and for every fraudulent batch destroyed, a dozen more appeared. The public, confused and weary, began to lump all coca wines together. Pure or poisonous, they bore the same stigma. The irony was bitter. The man who had brought coca into the salons of Europe now watched as his invention was dragged into its gutters. Where once his bottles gleamed behind mahogany counters, now they mingled with cheap gin and bootleg absinthe. He still received orders from loyal patrons, a queen here, a composer there, but even those came wrapped in discretion. The same society that had crowned him a genius now looked away when his name was mentioned. In his office on Boulevard Haussmann, Mariani kept the counterfeit bottles lined up along a shelf, examples gathered by his agents from across the continent. Some were crude, others nearly perfect. He studied them with fascination and despair. "They have stolen my face," he murmured once to his assistant, "and left me the shadow." At night, he dreamed of his early years, the quiet laboratory, the first bottle gleaming under lamplight, the thrill of discovery untainted by profit. But each morning, the city reminded him that discovery and desire could never be separated again. For every truth invented in the modern world, there would be 10 copies cheaper, quicker, crueler. And in that multiplication of miracles, even the original began to lose its meaning. Mariani's legacy, like his wine, had been diluted until no one could taste the difference between genius and greed. The theatre on the Boulevard des Capucines shimmered under the glow of gaslight, its facade dripping with gold and laughter. Paris in the late 1870s was a city possessed of light, invention, and exhaustion. Beneath the chandeliers, actors powdered their faces, singers stretched their voices, and the air behind the curtain throbbed with nerves. There was always too much to do, too much to prove, and in every dressing room, tucked beside rouge and lace fans, stood the same small bottle, curved, dark, glimmering red. Vin Mariani. To the performers, it was more than tonic, it was salvation. They sipped from it before stepping into the spotlight, the warmth blooming through their veins like applause. It steadied trembling hands, softened exhaustion, and coaxed courage from the hollow spaces of the heart. The soprano, who had nearly fainted last week, now sang like a woman reborn. The comedian, whose voice cracked from strain, could laugh again. "One glass," said the priest, director, "and it turns fear into art." Outside the theatre, poets drank it before reading, painters before sketching, journalists before writing. They swore it cleared the fog from their thoughts, that it opened some hidden door in the mind. "It does not intoxicate," said one critic. "It illuminates." The cafes around Montmartre became temples to this new communion, smoky, electric rooms where philosophy and intoxication waltzed hand in hand. Wine glasses clinked like bells. Someone quoted Baudelaire. Someone else claimed the coca leaf was the future of poetry. And all the while, beneath the chatter, hearts beat faster, Words came quicker, laughter grew sharper. Mariani himself attended these salons sometimes, moving quietly through the crowd, polite and modest. He carried himself like a pharmacist in a gallery of dreamers, listening as actors toasted his name, as painters called him the patron saint of inspiration. He smiled but said little. In his pocket, he carried a notebook filled with ideas for new advertisements, endorsed by the world's greatest performers. Every evening, the world gave him new lines to print. But even in the glitter, cracks began to show. The actors who had once glowed beneath the lamps now trembled when the curtain fell. They drank from their bottles not only before a show, but after, and then again at dawn when the body refused to wake without it. The poets who had praised its clarity began to write of fever and restlessness. One called it the wine that dreams of its drinkers. Still, Paris refused to see the danger. The city thrived on fever, the fever of invention, of speed, of art, and Vin Mariani fit perfectly into its pulse. Posters bloomed across the city, showing radiant faces lifting glasses toward the light. The words beneath read, "The wine that inspires, the wine that sustains." On the stage, the orchestra began its overture, the sound swelling through velvet and smoke. The actress took her final sip, feeling the rush spread through her chest, steadying her breath, quickening her heart. She stepped into the light, radiant, perfect, immortal for an hour. The audience rose to their feet, unaware that what they applauded was not only talent, but chemistry. And in the wings, her empty glass glowed like a candle left burning too long, a small, beautiful flame that would one day consume the age itself. The turn of the 20th century arrived not with fireworks, but with inspection forms and seals of approval. Where invention had once reigned unchecked, regulation now crept in, quiet and relentless. The new century demanded order, accountability, and above all purity. The same laboratories that had once been cathedrals of discovery now found themselves under the gaze of government clerks with ledgers and fountain pens. Chemistry, that shimmering art of the 19th century, had been domesticated. The dream of bottled vitality would henceforth answer to the law. In France, the Ministry of Health introduced new guidelines for tonics and stimulants. Every product containing substances of a narcotic or psychotropic nature was to be tested, registered, and labeled with its full ingredients. Vin Mariani, once advertised as the secret to eternal vigor, now stood on the wrong side of a bureaucratic line. Coca, once a symbol of civilization's triumph over fatigue, had been reclassified as dangerous, addictive, and foreign. Inspectors arrived at Mariani's former factory in early spring. The building was quiet now, half empty, its machines covered with dust. They moved through the halls with notebooks and clipboards, measuring barrels, reading formulas, cataloguing every ounce of coca leaf that remained. Their boots echoed through the great silent chamber where thousands of bottles had once glowed like stained glass. "It's a pity," one of them murmured, holding up a label embossed in gold. Beautiful craftsmanship. But beauty cannot excuse poison. Across Europe and America, the tide had turned. Cocaine, the purified child of Mariani's coca, had found its way into hospitals and alleyways alike, hailed first as a surgical marvel, then damned as a vice. The moral panic that followed consumed everything with the word coca on it. Legislators drafted bills, clergymen preached temperance, and doctors published dire warnings. Vin Mariani, once a miracle of modern medicine, was now an artifact of moral failure. In London, the Pharmacy Act of 1908 placed new restrictions on imported tonics. In Paris, the 1910 law on dangerous substances declared that all coca preparations were to be dispensed only under medical supervision. Bottles were confiscated from shop windows, posters torn down from walls. The language of science was replaced by the language of prohibition. Progress, the very thing Mariani had once symbolized, had turned on itself and demanded penance. But not everyone welcomed the purity crusade. Some chemists, older men who remembered the optimism of the 1860s, spoke bitterly of bureaucrats who fear discovery. "They have killed invention," wrote one in a defiant pamphlet. "They fear the spark of genius because they cannot regulate it." Yet even they obeyed the new rules, for the laboratories that refused soon found their doors sealed by order of the state. In a museum on the left bank, one of the last surviving bottles of Vin Mariani was placed in a glass case. The curator labeled it "Exhibit, the Age of Stimulation." Visitors stopped to admire it, the elegant curve of the glass, the golden label, the deep red wine that had once carried the pulse of an empire. Some read the placard and nodded approvingly at its cautionary tone. Others, standing in the dim light, felt something more complicated: nostalgia, perhaps, for a time when the boundaries between cure and craving had not yet hardened. The law had declared purity the new virtue, and the world obeyed, but the silence that followed felt less like cleansing and more like mourning, as though something vital had been filtered out of the bloodstream of progress, leaving behind only the faint aftertaste of what once seemed divine. The 20th century arrived gasping. Factories bled smoke into the sky, trains hissed across continents, and whole nations exhaled exhaustion. What had begun as optimism in the age of Vin Mariani had matured into something harder, faster, and infinitely hungrier. The world no longer sipped vitality, it consumed it in gulps. The industrial lungs of civilization drew in coal dust and exhaled progress, but each breath came shorter than the one before. Empires, once gilded with the polish of eternal vigor, now staggered beneath their own velocity. Britain still ruled the seas, but its heart, its human heart, was frayed. Clerks fainted at their desks, factory girls coughed into their aprons, soldiers returning from colonial wars trembled from nerves no tonic could soothe. In cafes from Cairo to Calcutta, men once proud of their endurance now drank black tea by the gallon, muttering of fatigue of the empire. The world that had once borrowed its energy from a crimson bottle now sought it in machinery, caffeine, and conquest. Breath itself had become a currency. To breathe faster was to live more fully, even if the lungs burned for it. In Paris, physicians coined a new term, épuisement civilisationnel, the exhaustion of civilization. They blamed the pace of telegraphs, the roar of trams, the endless press of light. The human frame, they warned, was not built for such perpetual motion. But no one listened. The war of speed had already begun. For those old enough to remember Mariani's wine, the new world felt eerily familiar. The same trembling hands, the same restless hearts, the same inability to sleep, only now, instead of coca wine, there were cigarettes, coffee, and the white tablets of modern chemistry. The drug had changed, but the faith remained. Humanity still believed it could outpace its own fatigue. In London's hospitals, doctors began noticing cases of nervous collapse among railway workers and telegraph operators. In New York, the newspapers called it Americanitis, a malaise of ambition. Prescriptions poured forth, electric baths, tonics, stimulants, without vice. Every cure echoed the rhythm of the old red bottle. The empire was merely breathing faster to keep itself alive. Meanwhile, in the quiet vaults of European museums, the last bottles of Vin Mariani sat sealed, their contents turned to dust. Yet somehow, the world still carried its scent, not in the air, but in its habits, its hunger, its heartbeat. Humanity had not outgrown the chemist's dream, it had absorbed it. The tonic had become metaphor, the bottle invisible but omnipresent, and across every city one could hear the same sound if one listened long enough. The collective inhalation of progress, the endless exhalation of weariness. It was the rhythm of locomotives, of typewriters, of lungs filled with smoke. The empire's breath, heavy and constant, rising and falling like the sea. No one yet knew that this rhythm would one day break, that the very speed sustaining civilization would also suffocate it. But in that moment, standing at the edge of a century still dazzled by its reflection, the world mistook the sound of its own exhaustion for triumph. The breath of empire filled every street and every heart, and for a fleeting instant it almost felt like life. Windsor Castle had always been a place of ritual. Every bell, every step, every curtain drawn at the same hour each day. Yet by the close of the century, something quieter had crept into its rhythm, a stillness that even the servants felt but dared not name. The Queen, once so faithful to her routines, no longer called for her tonic so often. The bottle that had once gleamed proudly beside her inkstand now sat unopened on the silver tray, its red contents dim in the morning light. It was not illness that had changed her habits, but unease. Rumors had reached the palace, faint at first, then impossible to ignore. Articles clipped from the Times and Le Figaro arrived in sealed envelopes, their headlines whispering of danger, imitation, and deceit. Her physicians, ever cautious, advised restraint. "The tonic remains beneficial, Your Majesty," said Sir James Reed gently, "but one must consider moderation." It was a delicate way of saying what he could not, that even royalty could become dependent on a bottle. The Queen did not answer at first. She merely glanced toward the window, where the winter fog pressed against the glass like an old grief. "So," she murmured, "the world has grown tired of miracles." She still allowed herself an occasional glass on cold mornings or when pain clouded her sleep, but she no longer asked for it in public. It became a private indulgence, as secret as prayer. Her ladies-in-waiting noticed the subtle change. Her appetite returned, but her laughter did not. The crimson warmth that had once steadied her now seemed to carry something heavier, like guilt distilled. In the royal pharmacy, the apothecary Collier handled the last remaining bottles with unusual care. He had watched the crates from Paris arrive for over a decade, stamped with the Mariani crest. Now fewer came each year, and each one was logged like contraband. "The court no longer favors foreign tonics," one courier explained. "There's talk of new laws limits on stimulants, dangerous preparations, coca among them." Across Europe, governments had begun to stir uneasily. What had once been marketed as refinement was now reclassified as risk. Laboratories inspected their inventories. Pharmacists locked away their stock. Even the Vatican, once proud of its papal endorsement, had grown discreet. A generation earlier, Mariani's name had adorned the walls of every embassy and hospital. Now it lingered only in whispers. One evening, as the Queen sat by the fire at Balmoral, her physician poured the last glass from an old bottle. She accepted it with a faint, wistful smile. "It reminds me of those years," she said softly, "when the world believed in progress without fear." The firelight caught the rim of the crystal, and for a moment the wine seemed to glow with its old promise. Then she drank it slowly, like one saying farewell. In Paris, Angelo Mariani did not yet know that the Queen had ceased to order his tonic, but he felt the silence growing, letter by letter, as his famous patrons fell away. The endorsements stopped, the orders slowed. The world, once drunk on invention, was sobering. At Windsor, the empty glass was washed and set aside. The next morning, Collier placed the remaining bottles back into their case and sealed them. The Queen did not ask for them again, and in that quiet omission, that unspoken withdrawal, an era ended. The palace, once warmed by the faint glow of coca wine, returned to its older rhythm. The slow ticking of clocks, the rustle of papers, and the distant echo of a world that had finally begun to wonder what it had been drinking all along. Winter light fell softly through the tall windows of Osborne House, bathing the Queen's writing desk in pale gold. The air smelled faintly of paper, ink, and the subtle sweetness of the Bordeaux tonic her physician had poured. Her Majesty, now in her 60s, sat wrapped in a black silk shawl, her hair pinned with quiet precision, her pen moving across parchment with slow, deliberate grace. The hand that once trembled now glided steadily, each line neat and firm. On the corner of her desk stood a half-filled glass, the faint red glow of Vin Mariani catching the morning light like a secret ember. It had become part of her life now, as much as her letters and prayers. A glass before correspondence, another before receiving ministers. Her physicians called it a restorative aid. Her ladies-in-waiting called it the Queen's cordial. She called it nothing at all, for to name it would make it common. But those closest to her noticed the change. Her voice, once slow and heavy with grief, had regained its strength. Her sentences snapped again with that old command that had once ruled half the world. Visitors to the court whispered that the Queen seemed renewed, her cheeks rosier, her eyes sharper, her wit unexpectedly alive. "Her Majesty's melancholy appears to have lifted," wrote a journalist in the Times. "The Queen once again possesses the vigor of youth." The article made no mention of the small crimson bottle, now kept discreetly in the royal pharmacy, nor of the Frenchman whose creation had quietly threaded its way into the veins of empire. At Balmoral, she often drank it in the garden before her morning rides. The wind would whip at her veil, and the chill would sting her cheeks, but the warmth in her blood felt eternal. "It lifts the spirit," she once remarked to her physician, "almost like prayer." The doctor smiled, said nothing, and poured her another. Even her letters changed. The correspondence, once weighed with sorrow, began to quicken with curiosity again. She wrote to her eldest daughter in Berlin of a remarkable tonic from Paris, mild, yet most invigorating. She recommended it to friends, to fellow royals, to bishops who wrote of their ailments. Soon, bottles bearing the golden Mariani label began appearing on tables in Vienna, Lisbon, and Stockholm. The Queen's quiet approval had spread across Europe like perfume through silk. In Paris, Angelo Mariani received a note from Windsor's physician, bearing the Queen's personal seal. The words were simple: "Her Majesty is grateful for your tonic, which has restored both strength and serenity." Mariani framed the letter in his office beside the one from the Pope. Together, they were proof of what he already believed, that faith and empire alike now bent their heads to science. But, within the palace walls, the Queen's attendants saw what the newspapers could not. On the evenings she did not drink, her hands shook slightly when she did not lifted her pen. Her temper shortened, her appetite vanished. The wine had become her shadow, invisible, constant, and indispensable. And so the glass remained by her side, day after day, gleaming faintly beside the inkpot as she wrote letters that would shape nations. The empire thrived, the Queen endured, and the bottle stood always within reach, the silent confidant of a monarch and the emblem of an age that mistook stimulation for strength. Outside, the bells of London tolled the hour, and in palaces and parlours across the world, others lifted their glasses to their lips, unaware that they were all partaking of the same royal sacrament, the communion of progress poured from a Parisian bottle.